das
jetzt ohne
ist alles da.
Ist alles da?
Kannst du mal kurz...
So PowerPoint? Ah, das... scheint alles zu... Ja, wir klicken die mal durch.
Start.
Yeah, we will ask.
Geh mal kurz in den Ordner rein, machen wir das wieder zu. Das ist speichern, wenn es ist. Das kannst du offen lassen. Geh mal in den Ordner rein.
Session?
Ja, mach mal erste Session. Nur falls. Je nachdem, wer es am Ende macht. Maja hat gerade gefragt wegen. So, nicht aufmachen. Aber die ich jetzt als zweite drin habe, die ist irgendwie gerade noch im Zug oder sowas. Wenn sie bis dahin nicht da ist, dann wird sie jetzt machen. Und jetzt nochmal Session 2 auf. Die auch nochmal kurz durch. Weil ich glaube, da fehlt eine Präsentation. Ja. Aber machen wir trotzdem. Okay. Dann machen wir Jörg Gleiter erstmal auf 3. Ne, machen wir nicht die. Machen wir PowerPoint. Oder mach beide, ist egal.
Ja.
Ne, ich hab einen USB.
Wait, he's getting one.
No, because I don't have it.
Okay, I see. This is not my laptop. This is kind of an issue. You can send...
What I can do.
You can have your presentation over your laptop.
Yes.
Do you have an HDMI?
I can just, in fact, I missed one page.
Okay, yeah.
Not more.
Yeah.
So what I can do is simply have my, so I go on and off like.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
the slides. Yeah, no, this is an issue because you can't just... Or yeah.
From read from to read from it, not
read from
yeah,
it.
yeah.
You can put your laptop here if you like.
Yeah.
Oh, not a problem.
In fact, I
We can-
stand here or
Yeah.
I stand there.
You're standing here.
Sollen wir anfangen? Liebe Gäste, willkommen. Es freut mich, dass ihr heute hier mit uns seid für dieses wundervolle Ereignis. Ich werde jetzt in Englisch sprechen, wegen unserer Gäste aus Slowenien, die nicht alle Deutsch sprechen können. So, dear guests, dear partners of the event, dear audience, thank you for coming this Friday afternoon. You could do so many better things in Berlin, but I promise you it will be very interesting. So please stay with us until the end. You know, yesterday I was walking past by a bookstore on Savigny-Platz, and look what I saw in the window. And I bought it straight away. It's a comic, it's a graphic novel about Plečnik, Jože Plečnik, the big architect that we dedicate this wonderful symposium and exhibition to. And Zoran Smiljanić, this author that made this graphic book novel, is a very known Slovenian author. So, yeah. Well, I was thinking when I saw this, I thought, well, maybe, you know, Jože Plečnik has now potential to become popular, not only in Berlin, but maybe also in Germany, and especially after this event, I hope. I will be short. I just want to use this opportunity to thank everyone who helped us to make this wonderful event happen. My dear friend, Boštjan Vuga, for connecting me with TU, with Institute for Architecture, and its team, and for collaborating on the concept for this event. I would like to thank the team of TU and Institute for Architecture and Department of Architectural Theory, especially Jörg Gleiter, and a big thank you, great Birgit Klauck. Without you, we would not be here today. Birgit Klauck also visited Ljubljana this spring, and a wonderful project happened. You can see it here on the walls there, regarding Plečnik, and she will tell you more about it. Then I also want to thank to the graphic designer, Primož Fijauš, he's sitting there, for this wonderful, remarkable job that he did in a very short time. He made the posters and the design for the small exhibition we have upstairs. And I want to thank also to Maja Vardjan for the idea for this exhibition, and the curator Tomaž Štoka, both from the Museum of Architecture and Design in Ljubljana. And last but not least to Jürgen, Maja, hi, and Olaf Nicolai, who is coming a little bit later, for responding to the invitation. Both of them know Ljubljana and Plečnik very well and have a special relationship to Plečnik. That's why they are here, and they will tell you more about it. And I should not forget to say that the Instagram profile for Plečnik now is absolutely spectacular. Thank you. What a wonderful idea. And thank you to all the students that made such effort to do it. It was also seen by our Minister of Culture, and she reposted it. So she thought it was absolutely great. We should maybe collaborate in the future for the next events. And yeah, thank you for making with your action on Instagram and also in public space with the posters, that you made Plečnik visible in both virtual and physical space. And thanks a lot also to both moderators, to Mr. Stollmann and Ms. Gasperoni. After the symposium, please don't leave this building. You are warmly invited to the exhibition upstairs, where the Director of Museum of Architecture and Design from Ljubljana, Bogo Zupančič, and Tomaž Štoka, the curator, will say a few words and will answer all your questions. And everything will be followed by a reception with Slovenian wine, which is excellent, by the way, and some finger food. And so don't miss out. Enjoy this symposium. Stay with us. And now I give the floor to Birgit Klauck, and at the same time, I want to give her this present so that you don't forget us and you don't forget Plečnik. And I know you will share this wonderful book with your friends and team from TU and the students. Yeah, and here's something also from Istria, Slovenian, you know. So you can maybe go segeln, you know, there. So please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so a very warm welcome from me as well. Official welcome to the guests, to speakers who came to Berlin, to the presenters, to everybody. And I also have a very long list of people to thank. And because the list is so long, I put it on the wall so that the students and everybody, it was quite a long process actually, so that everybody who was involved is on the list, I hope. That brings me to the display. As Saša already mentioned, we went in May, we went with a bunch of international students, a small group. We went to Ljubljana to see and to discuss what Plečnik, Jože Plečnik could mean to us today. And it was actually a very mixed group from all over the world, Bangladesh, Korea, Indonesia, Mexico, China, very mixed. I think they are present, not all of them, so in the break or afterwards you will have a chance to talk to them if you like, but there's also a short explanation of the mappings. Now, before I hand over the micro to Professor Jörg Gleiter, who will give a content-wise introduction, I would like to mention two people in particular. The first one is actually Boštjan Vuga. He has been teaching here at ADIP, and ADIP was the abbreviation of a permanent guest professorship at the Institute of Architecture, which unfortunately does no longer exist. Unfortunately, I say, because in retrospect, it has been a great success. We had Mark Lee as a teacher, who is today not only the professor, but also the chair of the Department of Architecture at the Harvard DSD. There was Jean-Philippe Vassal, who last year received the Pritzker Prize together with Anne Lacaton. And for those of you who are not architects in this room, the Pritzker Prize is one of the most prestigious awards in the field of architecture. We had Boštjan, and Boštjan, I'm certain we can expect great achievements in the future. And thank you very much for connecting the institutions and for coming here again. And I also want to thank Saša Šavel-Burkart, not only for the present, but for her commitment. She is the head of Skica, which is the cultural institution of the Slovenian embassy. And yes, I think she had to put up with the pitfalls of a large institution at some points, but thank you very much, Saša. It was great to have you. And now I pass on the word to Professor Gleiter, who will give the content, the introduction to the two sessions. Thank you.
Yes, well, also on behalf of the Department of Architectural Theory, I would like to extend my warmest welcome to you. The 150th anniversary of the birthday of I call him now Joseph Plečnik, is a welcome occasion to bring together some of the finest architects, scholars, and curators to reflect on the architectural work of Plečnik and its relevancy for it today. A good 40 years ago, in 1986, a great retrospective of Plečnik was shown at the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris. It was the times of post-modernity and its particular interest in the hidden discourses and the hidden narratives in architecture in particular. Plečnik was one of the main architects that re-emerged and was subject of much admiration and debate. I vividly remember that during my years as a student in Venice at the UF, this was mid-1980s, many of the professors organized pilgrimages, I would say, to Ljubljana, and Plečnik was literally in every mouth. Certainly, the interest in Plečnik has shifted, and I think this is very important to see. And we are now very interested in what Plečnik means for us today. And this is what we want to explore and to discuss today. Two topics emerged as central: the porous and porosity in regard to the urban developments of Plečnik, mainly in Ljubljana, and the uncanny, das Unheimliche, still probably two of the key terms with which one is able to grasp theoretically the work of Plečnik and understand the inner motives that drove the design of this exceptional architect. So we have two sessions. The first one deals with the concept of porosity in the urban condition. And the second one will deal with the uncanny and the aesthetic quality of his work. I'm not extending any thanks here because it was already done, but also I would especially thank only one person. This is Birgit Klauck. It was wonderful. You were the driving force for this conference here, and I think it worked out brilliantly. So I would like to wish you a great, insightful, as well as entertaining evening. And I now hand over the microphone to my esteemed colleague, Jörg Stollmann, to introduce the first session on porosity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörg. Also welcome from me. I'm very happy to open the first session, which will rather focus on the urban work or the impact of Plečnik's work on the urban. And I have to admit normally a moderator kind of also conceptualizes the sessions, but our first speaker, Boštjan Vuga, in the preparation of the conference, I think he was the one to put up the theme of porosity in public space. And I know this is a topic that Boštjan has worked on for quite a long time, also within the office and also in his teaching at the AA. I was just recently a guest critic when students were in very different urban contexts around the world were trying to figure out how the publicity of public space could be heightened, enforced, supported of buildings, accessibility through spatial concepts of porosity. So we really owe the concept and the kind of theme in which we will try to discuss the urban works of Plečnik to Boštjan. He will also be our first speaker, followed up by our two other guests, Maruša Zorec and Maja Vardjan. We will try to keep the following sequences a little bit open because Maruša is still on her way to tour. You arrived! Hey, welcome! Super, so we stay within the original concept. What a sport. And I will just tell the ones of you who don't know Boštjan and the other speakers, always in front of their contributions of 15 minutes, a little bit about their biographies. So Boštjan Vuga, he is an architect, educated at the Ljubljana School of Architecture and also at the AA School of Architecture in London. But his work extends architecture and urban contributions. He's also a researcher and educator, and also has edited books and contributions. I think in 2007 there was an architect's journal that you contributed already to the works of, and the relationship of architects to the work of José Plečnik. You have taught us many different schools, for example at TU Berlin. You are a professor also at the Faculty of Architecture in Ljubljana and currently leading a diploma unit at the AA School of Architecture. You have also taught at Belach Institute in Rotterdam and the IAAC in Barcelona, in Münster, friends of us, and the Conference School of Architecture in Lyon, and TU Graz, so a long teaching experience. I think what is very interesting and what convinced me when I learned to know you was the work of your office together with your partner Juri Sada. And I think you have really changed the landscape of Ljubljana and many other urban sites during this more than 20 years of office practice. And I think why your continuing interest in Plečnik now has even led to this conference is also maybe related to the presidency of the Architect Josef Plečnik Foundation Members Board, so you're also kind of officially working on supporting the spread, the heritage, the conservation of the work of Josef Plečnik. So without further ado, I would give you the mic for your put on Plečnik's take on porosity and your relation.
Technical problem. Alle. Hat er überhaupt keinen Strom? Okay. Anything happened or not yet? 1.5 minutes. Huh? 1.5 minutes, sorry. It was disconnected. I think it worked before.
It did work before, yes. It will be working.
Otherwise, I can just turn the laptop.
Siehst du die Präsentation? Passt? Okay. All right, we would be ready.
So, thank you, Jörg, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone. I need to be super fast, that we're on time. I'm going to start with these sort of like difficult sentences, And here you can read, I'm going to refer just to the term of boundaries. So because I'm really, really interested, and this was what I'm teaching and practicing is to what the boundaries are. What the boundaries are and how they can actually, connect to the experience of the public space, our own experience and experience, of the, let's say, general publicness. And boundaries are actually connected, social boundaries, individual boundaries, psychological boundaries are connected to the physical boundaries. And what I just demonstrated is actually an example of porosity, which, as you can, sort of read here, it's a measure of the void space in the physical matter. But, architectural porosity is defined by the boundaries. And the boundaries are actually then they're kind of like a hinge between physicality of a certain spatial sequence, space, and our experience, and kind of like our individual experience and our social experience in this space. So the more, and you just continue, the more porous, this is, I know, very kind of like strict and very sort of like sharp definition, but the more porous a space is, a spatial sequence is, the more inclusive it could actually become. The more, the stronger impact on different audiences could actually be in that kind of space. And from here, this is actually my understanding and actually also my sort of perception and contribution to, let's say, actualization of the Plečnik's work today. So Plečnik work is a true example of porous architecture. And you can actually see, I'm sure that my colleague would actually sort of tell more about, the language and, the kind of the expressions of Plečnik architecture. But here, I'm interested in architecture, Plečnik architecture boundaries, and how porous they are, and how this porosity is, as I put it down here, a source of endless attraction, provocation, play, and humor. And to kind of conclude with this sort of like written introduction, the porous spaces provide for the plurality of the individual experience and stimulate, and this is important, stimulate our desire for exploration and active participation. And this is actually where I find like Plečnik work today, in the beginning of the 21st century, really actual, really contemporary, really something where we, not just art historians, but where we architects as practitioners can really learn, learn from Plečnik, learn from Plečnik's work. So I decided, when I put this sort of short presentation together, I decided to kind of take you down the river of Ljubljanica, to kind of introduce how I see and how I kind of, take porosity of Plečnik's boundary as a sort of like a generator of, our own office work. So here we are down the river, and what we have here are, 4 levels: river level, lower embankment, higher embankment, and the roof. And three vertical layers, the arcades, the colonnades, and the existing building behind. So you see kind of like the Plečnik's language here kind of like plays with spatial sequences of very low space under, higher space of the colonnades above, lower space of arcades, higher space of the colonnades above, And we continue down the river, and this kind of porosity of the layers, porosity of the arcades, porosity of the colonnades above, change and become kind of completely or almost closed, to kind of define the interior of that building. So kind of like you move down the river and you see, how the nature and character of the boundaries actually change. And going even further down, you come to an interruption. And this interruption, it's something, you would kind of ask, why is that? Why is that there, It's an interruption, it's kind of like a loggia. Loggia, again, like 2 stories, lower sort of condensed shrink space below, and kind of like an ample high space above of the loggia. So why the loggia with a view to the river? What is actually, what does it generate? What is that? And, when we get into the loggia, it's a kind of space, it's a pure atmospheric spatial setting, We are there, we actually, we have like a very sort of like uninterrupted view, view down to the river, and we are moved away from the kind of circulation of the market space. So it's kind of like the loggia itself becomes a sort of like still space where we sit down and kind of enjoy that or view to the river. At the same time, as you actually view here, the loggia actually extends the space of the market and connects it to the other side of the urban setting. If we move now up, we're actually moving up again. We are sort of in front of the market, close market. But in front of the market, in close market, it's another layer, another kind of boundary, the boundary of the colonnade. So this boundary of the colonnade provides kind of completely different condition, public condition, in that spatial sort of setting of the market. The boundary becomes kind of like a space which is covered, which actually provides kind of like that you can pass by, but also you can kind of sit here or stay in front of the shops, kind of like cafes, restaurants, when the rain is. So this sort of like diversity and variety of the public atmosphere contribute to the kind of our own individual experience, but saying that, it also generates the publicness of the market. This is actually a very interesting point, where the 2 sort of like colonnades actually meet. It's a kind of like almost one would say kind of like a crash point, like the 3 layers on the right-hand side meet the 2 layers on the left. And then the meeting, it's not smooth. It's kind of like it kind of really sort of like stop and break each other. So the colonnade, the 2 layers, we are now kind of in the space of the colonnades from the beginning. It's kind of widened, becomes widened, so wide that it can actually house, an additional activity. It affords for an additional activity. So Plečnik was very, very clever, kind of very sort of, really like a master of dimensions which actually connects them to porosity. What is the width relation between the width and the height? Relation between the dark and light. Relation to the kind of like a very high and very low space. From here, we actually enter down to the fish market, to the kind of like enclosed market. And this is, I mean, I found like this is kind of really an incredible folly of the boundaries, So you have, everything is wrong here, It's kind of like you have like too many, columns, which are structurally not needed. You have another window to the sea. You have this kind of pilasters as a kind of like a fence without the railing, in order to kind of bring you down to the space, and this is the next sequence, which is completely austere, This sort of, like the change of the character of the boundaries becomes something, Plečnik kind of leads and guides us to experience of that space. So we enter, and we are now in the sort of cold, fish-smelling space of the market, with a view down to the river. Passing through So imagine like kind of like really the smelly monofunction of the fish market, passing to the really strange space. So we are now down in the loggia, kind of shrinked between super thick pillars, you know, kind of which limit our view to the river, but we can still sit down and view that, you know, kind of like really framing the view. You know. So this then continues down to the moment, you know, where we really have the break. So what you see here on the upper drawing, it's actually the break where Plečnik in 1930 actually designed the bridge. And the bridge, the Butcher's Bridge so-called, you know, has never been realized according to his plan. In 2010 or 2009, the city announced the competition for the kind of new Butcher's Bridge, you know. And I'm kind of showing our example, our project, our proposal. Before that, this is actually what Plečnik proposed. I think it was really, really interesting if you kind of like follow the sequence, you know. So loggia kind of extends onto the river and becomes kind of a temple on the river. But the temple with kind of if you see here, you know, with a sort of exaggeration of the structure. So it's like a very dense temple. Very dense in terms of sort of like a very kind of like porous space, which you would, as an experience of this space, as a perceiver, user kind of like meander through. And this project, this temple, it's actually the house on the water. It's the bridge as a destination, not just the bridge as a point where you actually come to get like from A to B. While developing our own proposal, we sort of try to find a reference on another Plečnik project, and it's an early work on for the crypt in the Church of Holy Spirit in Vienna, which, you know, as you see here, it defined this two spatial setting, two spatial height, very low space and very sort of like very low space above and very high space below. And we use that again, you know, the structure is emphasized. I mean, you see here, you know, and you kind of feel that maybe there is, you know, if I simply say there is kind of too much of the structure, you know. We use that, and then following, you know, the walk down to the river, you know, walk down the river as I just took you, know, we developed like a proposal which kind of like turned this upside down. So the lower space is below, and the upper space is above. So this is actually our, I wouldn't even call it like a paraphrase of the bridge itself, you know, which kind of like consists of three slabs, you know, three waffle porous slabs where light could actually penetrate through, and kind of like bell columns, stalactites and stalagmites, which kind of sort of form, connected together, form like a very kind of rigid structure. So kind of the same principle, you know, like a bridge as a destination, bridge as kind of like a space where you would go also without having just intention to pass from A to B. You go there, you know, just to stay on the water. You go there, you know, to kind of extend the physical experience of the space, of the open air market onto the and above the river. So kind of as we had the loggia before, you know, this sort of space of you know, like the extension of the market where you go there and sit down. This again, you know, becomes like the space of pure appropriation. Space, you know, where you can actually, no function is prescribed. It's kind of pure space of, you know, which can actually afford like for different activities to happen. Below, it's completely different. Below, again, you know, we follow like the principle of the market. it's shrink, kind of condensed space, we come in, and here would be kind of an extension of the selling stalls, you know, like selling goods. Yeah, 1 minute. I have just 1 minute. You know. So it's so here, you know, you see that the house of the water, I mean, the bridge has nothing to do with the bridge. It's kind of like the structure is moved from the edges. Even the circulation is put in the middle, like the ramp, which actually kind of connects both levels. And with a series of kind of columns, you know, we kind of create like this different porosity of the boundaries, which then relates to the Plečnik's promenade. I mean, Plečnik's colonnade and arcade. And even like the balcony, you come to the end and you have like the balcony on the bridge is something which would be kind of specific. The last thing is the extension down to the river, which was sort of like something which was not sort of provided, or it was not kind of part of the Plečnik's bridge, as, you know, an extension to the first level to the lowest level of the river. So to conclude, this is, you know, connection. It's not in language. It's not in mimicking. It's not in kind of trying to do a sort of replica, or even like to replicate Plečnik's language, but to really understand the porous, the quality of the porosity of the boundaries, and create like an object which would be new, actual, and different, but at the same time would follow like a spatial setting and character of the arcades and colonnades. Thank you.
Super on time, thank you. Because I was told I have to be the master of ceremony, so we can really keep the schedule and have enough time for questions and people want to discuss for you. So let me introduce you to Maruša Zorec, and we have never seen each other. It's the first time we meet, but I was quite impressed looking at your portfolio. Maruša also studied at the Faculty of Architecture in Ljubljana, and she's also teaching there since '93. Your kind of place of work and life is also Ljubljana, and since '96 you founded the office Area Architects, and the office received several national awards, and mostly for renovation and very kind of sensitive and amazing work on historic renovation of buildings, but also working with protected environments and historical contexts. There are some kind of major works that you'll find also on the office webpage, which is, for example, the chapel of the Franciscan monastery in Ljubljana, and the renovation of the castle outbuilding in Ormond, which I found like extremely beautiful. And also I think you did the renovation to Plečnik's own house, and I think this also is then the link to the next session, where we also have an artist who is working, Olaf Nicolai, working on installation within this kind of newly refurbished building. Yes, and I think you have participated also in exhibition projects showing Plečnik's work, but also working on the Venice Biennial, contributing to kind of publicize Slovenian modern architecture of the post-war period. So I think, and I had a little glimpse into the lecture you proposed, which is about spatial connections, and I thought this was really beautiful, so I'm excited to give the panel to you. Maruša, please.
Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation to the Technical University, to Birgit, Klauck, to Boštjan, Vuga, and all the organizers. It's really an honor to be here to participate in this event. I'm a practicing architect doing on the field of interventions in the existing tissue. And step by step, slowly, I got involved also in the projects that were done by Plečnik, and through this, not working with his house, but also studying his students and other generations, I started to somehow understand what actually he was meaning. And if I refer to what Boštjan was saying, that he's interested in the boundaries, I'm just the opposite. I'm interested in the void. But the void does not exist without the boundaries, you will say, of course, and therefore I think they are both very much connected. And so this evening I will speak more about the void that is shaped by Plečnik's boundaries. And I think in this sense, this phenomenon of porosity is very much important because it emphasizes the dynamics of the space of the void. And of course, I'm very much interested in the topics that are here, like the concept of his work, not just the materialization, but mostly the idea behind it, the radical transformation of the existing, the dynamic space between those boundaries, and of course, about his generosity. Therefore, I would like just first to read some couple of sentences that I wrote for this event, and then we'll pass through quickly of some images. Jože Plečnik is considered to be a strict, severe, and closed personality. I think his public projects show us just the opposite. They are open, playful, connecting, and generous. His buildings are monumental, but his public spaces and places are introducing human scale. They open the inaccessible areas of the city, articulate axes with landscape and columns. They connect riverbanks with large bridges and bring us to the water with a long staircase promenade. His interventions create places of city's identity. And how does he conceive that? I see his work as strongly conceptual and modern because of its speciality. His voids are dynamic and endless, despite the classical language of their borders. Spaces flow in different directions and with diversified intention. He radically transforms the existing with unveiling its essence and establishing different percentage of its porosity. By intensifying the found and adding the new, he defines the limits of the space. With the differentiation of its porosity, he creates relations between inside and outside and guides us on a limitless journey through the city. With his interventions, he enlarges the public space of the city and offers it to us for free. Transformation of the existing open plan, dynamic void, and freedom of public space usage are things that we also strive for with the architecture we conceive today. So, let me take you now through my slides. Here you see some images of him from his childhood, where you see a very gentle, sensitive young man coming to Vienna here on the last image. But later on, through the periods where he was taken photographs of, he was really passed to us as a very strict, severe personality. But I think that he somehow has a kind of duality in this person. And this first image shows this friendliness to me much more than his, let's say, compositional photograph of his mature period. The same I find is in his buildings, where we know the monumentality mostly of his architecture, like the National Library, coming to more gentle interiors and, of course, to a very subtle, intimate spaces like the one of his home, or very precious, one of my favorites, his baptisterium in the Stranja church. So the same happens also in the public space, or even more. Like the monumental spaces of the marketplace that Boštjan already introduced, come to the Garden of the Death of the Žale cemetery. But later on, he offers us for free, without any commercial use, the steps towards the river where we can sit and reflect the time passing by. So I think he opens to us the public space in a very large dimension, which is the things we actually do today. We are striving strongly to open the public areas of the city. With his interventions, somehow he connects the city into a network of axes. One axis is the one that's traveling from the south to the north. It's a so-called culture axe. There is a gesture along the river, and then is an axe that ends at the final project that I'm going to show you, the project on a very small scale above the castle hill. So I'm going to show you 3 projects very briefly that are somehow working on the opening of the space. We were working on that with my students at the faculty and trying to show how he, in a way, does this in a very radical, transformative way. One project is here along the Bogo Street, close to the National Library. The second one is on the Roman wall, and the final one is here on the castle here. So this is the Crusaders Monastery. You see the photo how it was before he started his project. And you see in the schemes how he interfered with this. Actually, he scratched off the plaster of the whole, these perimeter walls. This is something you have to know is not possible today. He broke into the windows and he put inside the monastery a school of applied art. He brought kids inside to study inside those spaces. So you see the layering of the interior rooms. You see somehow this porosity of elements, which is here, in fact, to introduce a three-dimensional space, and of course to bring inside different levels of public rooms for people together, to live and to experience these open areas. And of course, to bring us the views from the outside into the inside. I have to tell you that this was done in the 50s, that today these windows are closed. You don't see inside anymore. The Festival of Ljubljana, who is taking charge of the school and is soon going to occupy the whole area, kicking out the kids and closing this monastery back again. So this is something that we protest, and we hope it's not going to happen. The next project is along the Roman wall. These are the findings before Plečnik somehow came. And what has he done? He put on the wall several elements that you see them. He treated it as a kind of linear element, and he broke through the wall. And on every intervention, he put an element, and by that, making this remain public. Otherwise, if you look today, they would put a rope around it and would not let anybody to come to the wall, like you see his elements brought here. But today, people are climbing here. Every day, they are sitting on the top of the pyramid. It's public space, what he did. And the last project is here on the castle hill. This is actually my favorite project of him. And I don't show my projects because somehow I try to introduce these spatial dynamics that I will try to explain here in the renovation of his house, but you have to visit his house to experience that in one-to-one. So on the castle hill, there was a small remain of a fortress, a Schanze is called this area. And he was asked somehow to do here an intervention. So you see some of the sketches that we found, but actually he was mostly working on the side. He was never really, he was changing his plans all the time, as also I do, I have to admit, but somehow we have no really actual plans. He treated the axe that is arriving to this end of the hill, to this small ruin, like an axe with the alley of the tree. And he shaped the terrain radically. He geometrized the terrain. You will see photos afterwards. And then he treated this hill as a kind of a cone. He cut off the top of the cone, and he introduced a circular pathway around it. And he put a bridge above this ruin, and somehow he's with his bridge holding this ruin. But not just that. By that, he's organizing the void, circulating in a kind of a space loop around the ruin, around his intervention, and around the landscape, of course. So these are some drawings by my students, how he's putting all his interventions on the existing. What he actually did is that he scratched off the outer perimeter of the ruin. He scratched off the stones to show just much more how this ruin is actually ruined, which was also not possible today. And here you see these public works shaping the terrain. And you see, of course, his interventions, how they were done at the time of their execution. Now I will just take you on the walk through this. You see this alley arriving to this circular pathway around the cone, moving through the space. This movement is very important, but this movement is free. Everybody can go his own way, and that's what I find really beautiful. And people are actually using this place very, very much. So you go here and you already see his bridge that is going above this circular pathway, moving through, and from the backside then you see the staircase of the element that is put on this ruin. And you see this circular round pathway around the hill. So you see the dramatic spaces that are somehow conceived between the geometry of the ruin and the circular wall, and you are entering these spaces and coming from the outside, looking at the ruin back again. And going back on, you can step on the hill above, and when you're on the top of the hill, you enter the bridge on the upper side. And you move through the bridge here slowly, and then at the end, you come to the view to somehow the open horizon above the city. So you don't know that there is a staircase down there, but you are just faced to the view, to the place where you came from. So this is it from my side. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. So we will have as a third presenter of tonight, Maja Vardjan, and I think you will bridge also the work of Plečnik and the urban work of Plečnik to contemporary practice and to a discourse that you're leading at your institution, the MAU, the Museum of Modern Architecture and Design in Ljubljana. Maja Vardjan is a curator, engaged for quite some time in the discourses of architecture and design at the museum. She has worked on numerous exhibitions and publications, so I just named a few, like Under a Common Roof, Modern Public Buildings from the museum's collection and other archives, but also Made in, Craft and Design Narratives, and The World Inside, Designing Modern Interiors from 1930s till today. So your work really spans a lot about the 20th century and even contemporary design and practice. And I'm super curious what we will bring from the local discourse that you build up, like to our school, and how we can engage with what you do in a discussion afterwards. Thank you, Maja.
So good afternoon also from my side. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, of course, for the invitation to this event. I'm very honored to be here and to discuss a project I did recently, the project that is called Glossary. So I will speak, in fact, about Plečnik's public domain in a rather unusual way. I will present it with terms, with words or phrases proposed by experts from various disciplines for the exhibition project I curated for the City Museum of Ljubljana that also manages Plečnik's house and the main Plečnik's archive. So, on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of the birth of architect Jože Plečnik, the City Museum of Ljubljana was organizing a comprehensive exhibition which opened in June 2022. The exhibition, entitled Plečnik Metropolis Place Garden, also includes a smaller independent show which is based on contemporary reflections on Plečnik's work. So the starting point of that exhibition was the topicality of Plečnik's architecture and urbanism for the present day. And as you see, this project was a collaboration of 2 museums and 3 curators, and Tomaž Štoka is also with us today. So Plečnik is a unique architect on a global scale, and his works are some of the most original and specific examples of 20th century architecture, which are impossible to place in any architectural movement that we know. So as you have already seen from previous presentations, they also provide an exceptional number of reference points for the present time. And their actuality, their topicality, is constantly growing in the light of current social, economic, and cultural changes. When I was invited to curate this project, I was considering many possible formats, and finally I proposed a hybrid between exhibition and publication. So the project was conceived as a total experiment, and its aim was to create a glossary that will address Plečnik's work through the responses of contemporary practitioners and theorists. And their task was to highlight, in the format that was defined by the exhibition, the term they consider essential for understanding of Plečnik today. So why glossary, in fact? If we want to talk about Plečnik from the critical position of today, we need to invent new terminology. While in the past discussions on Plečnik's oeuvre were full of terms and vocabularies that many researchers and authors assembled from the perspective of their own special social, economic, political context, this glossary proposes an entirely new stock of words that in fact are aimed at actualizing an understanding of Plečnik in our current condition. So how do we think, how do we live, how do we interpret Plečnik today? This question has triggered a set of very relevant responses, I think, on Plečnik's creative production. So we asked different authors. You see the names on this slide. There were architects, artists, curators, designers, philosophers, landscape architects, to propose a term, its definition, and a visual contribution that captures it. So we were interested on, in fact, intellectual positions, as well as very intuitive curiosity of the invited authors that could focus either on the context of their own work or projects or broader discourse. So it was really up to them. This is in fact the actual exhibition, or one corner of it to be precise. So we decided in fact to present the terms and definitions on the gray three-dimensional plates that in fact in the space create a kind of constellations of ideas, and when they put together they also stimulate new terms and new interpretations which each visitor. So the exhibition was conceived as a kind of open-ended structure that continues to be developed after the exhibition and will later result in a publication. So in fact, what was interesting when I was invited to present this project within this symposium is that majority of the terms that authors proposed in a way address public aspects of Plečnik's work. I will now focus just on the few terms. I hope I can manage 7, but give me a sign when I come to the end. I can cut immediately. And the first term, of course, is porosity by Boštjan Vuga. I will not explain it in detail because you heard it from the first hand. I just wanted to show it, in fact, how Boštjan put the illustration, how he related to the notion of porosity that he described. Coming to, this was the detail, just the position that you see before. And now we are on Vegova Street in Ljubljana. And this is a street which Plečnik transformed into a kind of hybrid between the street and the park. And the architect created its composition by gradually adding smaller elements and connecting them into a whole. And this situation was the starting point for Belgian architect Radim Lauda and photographer Maxime Delvaux, who proposed the term assemblage. And let's take a look what is happening here. We see the heads of the composers that rest in a way semi-cantilevered on this stone pillars. And the tree kind of swallows the back of the heads, which was not the original intention of Plečnik, but it happened later through the years. You see the sculptures are positioned on a masonry plinth, and this plinth is in a height of a bend, so you can sit on it. And the plinth also, in a way, extends to the park with the promenade above. And what you cannot see on this image are, in fact, the entrances of the buildings in the background that Plečnik all addressed differently. So we could go on describing this situation. What I wanted to stress, that all these relations between different objects and places that are connected by master's plan represent, and now I quote the definition, a way of thinking about architecture as a relational object, a narrative assemblage that offers constantly renewed experiencings and understandings of the space. End of quote. So the authors of this definition, they point out Plečnik's mechanisms, his approaches, not his aesthetics. And in that way, they celebrate the rational, the relational, the irrational, the relational, and the complex in the public space. So Vigava Street is a prime example how Plečnik builds a complexity. And the pineapple, for those who are curious, is a student project that was developed at the Faculty of Architecture in Ljubljana by the authors of this term. And then there is another term that very strongly resonates in the exhibition, and that is imagination, by landscape architect Anna Kuchan. She compares Plečnik's work to a garden as heterotopia, and again I quote, heterotopia that is maintained in communication between nature and culture, the corporeal and spiritual, the real and imagined. A garden that is in its essence anti-utilitarian, a space for the imaginary. So for Anna, these terms open effect, these spaces, this kind of spaces, open a political dimension in Plečnik's work, because in our current society, where everything needs to be functional, where everything needs to have a purpose and be useful, Plečnik wakes up our ability to dream, to be able to imagine. And this is what Maruša also showed before, Trnova Quay, a part of Plečnik's regulation of Ljubljanica River that remain open to interpretation. So Plečnik's projects open up new possibilities. And in fact, this openness is subversive because it is in fact a tool in the city that gives us freedom to imagine. Next term is body-body. And it was coined by the artist Maruša Sagadin that also in a completely different way addresses public space. So while Sagadin talks about her relationship to Plečnik, she also, in a way, thematizes her personal feminine principles, building a city against masculine powers in creation of urban space. She is an architect and a sculptor that intervenes in public space with playful and humorous elements that could be also read as a harsh criticism of the rigidity of urban design. So in fact, she wrote a rap song, and she said this is the only way she can communicate with a great master, because while she raps, she's really rapping, she feels more powerful and daring. I can definitely not rap, but let me read a piece of her text. He dominates the city. Urban planning was the exclusive domain of men. He builds bridges. I sneak into the city's landscape. And I transform domesticity and femininity into public infrastructure. So despite different positions and starting points, Sagadin and Plečnik built public space by carefully thought of compositional wholes, always keeping in mind that urban spaces are indeed spaces for human gatherings. They always have in mind a human. We are both crazy about human scale, raps Maruša. And you will see now the sketches that are in fact glued on the paper column. Another term that I think is important to bring up, and this is not the illustration of public space, but you will understand that because he uses the same principles also while designing the public space. The term is resourcefulness, brought up by design curator Jane Witters, and according to her, Plečnik's case takes many forms of resourcefulness, including social, economic, material resourcefulness, as well as a kind of fourth dimension, we could say, the creative resourcefulness. So what you see in this example of St. Michael's Church in Varja, he was embracing what we call now, in fact, a collective construction method, because he engaged the local community to help in creating this economical building. So the four massive concrete pillars that you see are repurposed sewage pipes, and they were polished by locals in the winter months to prepare the smooth surface for painting. And the sculptural chandeliers were assembled from various found parts, including horns, drinking glasses, Turkish coffee grinders, and other household items. And this kind of resourcefulness you can also find in Ljubljana's urban spaces. I think the exhibition upstairs also presents few examples. Very quickly, I jump from resourcefulness to participation because they're related, and this is a term that was presented by artist Maretica Putrč, because in 1944, the architect Jože Plečnik proposed a project under the municipal roof to the city of Ljubljana, and the city would construct a large canopy roof and provide the communal infrastructure for the neighborhood, and the residents would build their houses under this common roof. So this proposal articulated a way to grow city in partnership with the citizens, again public, and Plečnik in this respect can join architects like Jona Friedman or Alejandro Aravena, who similarly proposed alternative building solutions built on the participation of the residents. So here you see the drawing of the Plečnik student, in fact, and the drawing by Maretica Putrč about Plečnik's approach to the city plan that provide, in fact, a common roof for the people. The last term is, in fact, a term that, again connected to the term participation, highlight Plečnik as socially responsible architect, even as activists, as Miloš Kosset suggests in his term activism. So Kosset stressed that a true architect has the ability to occasionally stop and decide not to build. And Plečnik, with his numerous realized and unrealized projects, is an example of practice-oriented architect. But we also know the documents that, in fact, testify otherwise. In fact, he was, in his letter to the mayor of Ljubljana, he urged to say that the town's Roman walls that Maruša showed from destruction, because they were meant to be torn down and houses should be built on that site. So Plečnik does put himself forward as a critical activist for public space and heritage rather than the designer and builder as he was commonly known. And the illustration is Plečnik's letter to the mayor from 1934, and then the open letter in Delo newspaper written by today's activists fighting to save and open Plečnik Stadium. So in fact, activism has been one of the ways of creating, preserving, and occupying the public space, also for Plečnik. So we could go on and on. One of the terms is, for example, crossings and not, that was proposed by Olaf Nicolai, and it relates to the notion of topology and non-linearity of Plečnik's spatial concept. But I will conclude, we can continue in discussion. The aim of this project, the aim of the glossary, is in fact to create an open vocabulary that could constitute a frame of reference for a new contemporary discourse on Plečnik's architecture based on the subjective and critical reflection of Plečnik's work. And as you saw, the responses extend well beyond the established and conventional understanding of Plečnik as a key personality of Slovenian and urban architecture. And in fact, rather than a thing of the past, his work and approaches are interpreted as provocative source of new ideas, new projects, and new visions. That's why we all are, in a way, coming back to Plečnik's work. Thank you.
We have to now shift to the microphone, right? Yeah. So may I Test, 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 test. Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you for the microphones. So we have about, like, I would say now, about 20-ish minutes to have a small break before the next panel. But yeah, really, I want to thank you again for the contributions. And I also want to, at one point, quickly open up to the audiences. Well, Maja, your last contribution, it seems like that guy can be used for everything. A little bit, you know. So I was wondering, like one question would be, not that I'm not fascinated with the work, but could you maybe talk a little bit, and maybe each one of you, about how this work resonates with practicing architects in Slovenia at the moment, and why you think and when it came about that he was somebody to, in the end, recognize yourself and bring up questions. So this would be my first thing. And my second was, Boštjan, you talked very abstractly, spatially about porosity. But I heard in Maruša's lecture that it was talked about, you can go there for free. You can enjoy this space without paying. There's no, like, these spaces are accessed without, you know, paying entry because they're probably public and they have not yet been commercialized. But if there's also a certain change in how Ljubljana has transformed in the recent years, that exactly those spaces and the porosity and accessibility of those spaces and still being accessible becomes possible. So the first one would be a question about a certain psychological of our generation architect, and the second one about the political economy a little bit behind keeping these spaces alive.
Yes, I did. In fact, as I said, this is a kind of open-ended process, this glossary, before we finish, before we publish the book in 1 year. So I would like to also encourage everybody who thought of something, a term that would be relevant to contact us. But I did an analysis of the terms that I got. And in fact, it was interesting to see what kind of terms architects propose and what kind of terms artists, philosophers, and other thinkers, theoreticians proposed. And in fact, the architects, and here I'm answering to your question, what they see is the public space. In fact, the openness of the public space, the accessibility of the public space, the way of building, structuring public space with, in fact, smaller elements, like in assemblage, that you put together and, in fact, create a kind of tension, the complexity of the space. And another thing is materiality of his buildings, because what is interesting in Plečnik, that, in fact, he used always raw materials. He hated plaster. When he studied in Italy, he had a trip in Italy, he wrote a text that, in fact, the plaster is something that is unnecessary. It's a kind of wrongdoing for the architect. So this kind of exposed materials is also something that resonates a lot in the, let's say, Ljubljana School of Architecture. And also the way he used materials is that he had, in fact, no hierarchy of what is rich or poor, what is prefabricated and what is really crafted, because he also put materials into kind of juxtapositions that were unusual. So it was not important if something was very expensive or something was very cheap. So I would say in this that he kind of transfers his ideas about the public space, the way you build it, the urban space, and through the materials. And of course the relationship, the porosity between the inside and outside, which in Plečnik's case, even if you're inside the building, you always have a kind of sense or kind of relationship to the outside.
Maruša, you want to maybe add or talk about your own position?
Well, yes, I must say that if you ask how Plečnik is somehow seen by practicing architects today, I have to say that all the friends that come from abroad to Ljubljana, they want to see Plečnik. And I was wondering, why so? No, why don't they want to see what we do today, in a way? And through that, somehow, I came to I was thinking that probably it's not just actually the materialization of the walls, the classical, that was perhaps considered interesting in the 80s when this exhibition was in the time of the postmodernism. I found very beautiful texts that were writing about the concepts of his work and actually about the space, how he's working. And that's why I wanted somehow to present what really interests me is this these dynamics of the space, no? How the space is moving or in one direction or also through the walls, that somehow how Boštjan develops this idea of porosity, actually it's present in all his work, and it's guiding you through the space in not just in one direction, but it's opening these spaces in 3 dimensions. And that's what I really find extremely interesting. And of course, the second thing what Maja mentioned is, of course, the usage of materiality and his somehow playful language. For instance, my favorite case that also you showed is a closet that he did for a kind of a community that had no church, and they had no money for a church. So he built a closet in a school, a simple wooden closet that was shown on your photo. And he put a marble inside the closet, for instance, that marble that is so heavy, but it's so precious, the Carrara marble. So with that, he created an altar. So with this, let's say, transformation, or putting on just the opposite as somebody would think of, he transforms the simple object into a kind of a sacred object for me. And these ways of his thinking are really interesting for me, that in my work, what I do, but not directly, of course, following the form. No, form is not important in this case.
I mean, if I just add to what Maruša just said, it's very personal, I mean, we've been, imagine that you kind of like, you study in Ljubljana, you're kind of like, confronted and sort of, Plečnik kind of hovers all around you. And you're in the school, and then you kind of like, you need to, draw, even like construct his sort of typography, and then you really learn about it and learn about that. And what it costs, it's kind of like rejection, I mean, it's the first, when we finish studies, I say, okay, I mean, don't even mention the word Plečnik anymore, And basically, this sort of natural rejection, then I'm talking about, kind of like, not the youngest, not even like less young, but it's kind of like a kind of middle-aged generation of practicing architects. It's kind of interesting, how Plečnik, or actually his works, come sort of slowly back, but in a completely different light. I mean, it's not about, art history. It's not about kind of like historical movement, It's not about like, kind of viewing and perceiving just the materiality, but it's really, and this is also what I think that both 3 of us kind of wanted to show you today, it's about kind of really understanding the spatial qualities, understanding the material qualities, understanding something which is not kind of pre-postmodernist as he was actually named in the 90s. So, it's also liberating Plečnik's works of Plečnik himself, And I think this is really important, It's kind of really perceiving the work and kind of, I would even say, like forgetting about a little bit about the author,
But it's now when you explain it, I wonder, is it also partly a post-rationalization, like you having been coined, then trying to free yourself from this supposed master, producing work, but having also been influenced by the spaces that you experienced, that you lived in, like the qualities, and then, like, is the bridge, would you say, like, do you talk about the bridge concept retrospectively differently now than you would have at the time when you did the competition?
It's kind of like I can make it up, you know. Now. I think that, you know, the crypt I showed, it was really like a reference, you know. And understanding the crypt, but also turning it 180 degrees, you know, it's kind of understanding, you know, how the space of the you know, the open market, actually, the marketplace actually works, you know, on two levels, you know. But I'm not saying that, you know, that this is the right way, you know. It's just, you know, Plečnik, and I'm really fond of this kind of opening up. It's kind of like freeing the space. And it's not freeing space just for, you know, appropriation of different uses, but it's kind of like freeing the public space in terms, you know, how one or how a practitioner architect can actually learn from, you know. And that's why it's so vivid. That's why it's so vivid, because it's not kind of like a master plan design of urban design, you know, where everything needs to be kind of determined and sorted off and kind of like fixed, but it gives kind of possibilities, you know.
Maja.
No, I just wanted to say that in Ljubljana, for those who visited Ljubljana, you know that it's quite a small city. So if you work in a center, you encounter Plečnik. It is impossible to escape him. So he's all around us. And if you look at how Plečnik was perceived till, in fact, 2007, when Boštjan did a special edition of AB magazine. So I think you were one of the first who tried to free Plečnik from himself in our minds as well. That was a kind of switch where we moved from the big master as a personality, as a kind of enigmatic personality, to his approaches. And I think that this is something that is relevant for practicing architects as well as for others today. And also, he was always seen as somebody who builds on the existing context, who picks up existing things and then kind of rearrange it and so on. But in fact, he was also very harshly denying that context. And he was in fact building things. He was making his own context, you know. He was sometimes negating the existing. And this kind of understanding of Plečnik, of somebody who built on the existing content, is also switching and changing now. Because if you look at how things he built were perceived at the time they were brought up, they were critical toward them, you know. To build this huge national library in the structure of this kind of city urban tissue was a brutal act. But it's a masterpiece, and now it belongs to Ljubljana, and you cannot imagine it otherwise. So I think that in the last 15 years we are switching, in fact, the perception of his work, and also use it as a kind of pool of ideas. You saw one slide at the beginning. There were models from the students at Faculty of Architecture who detected a kind of archetypical spaces, and they use it now to communicate their own work.
Yeah, let's maybe drop my second question. I would be super interested to kind of enroll you in, maybe some of you who know the work, who've been to Ljubljana or interested as students, how to deal with kind of models, masters, to kind of find your own position. Please. Do I see a sign? No, somebody's scratching his head here. Yeah, Lidia.
Yeah, many thanks also for your perspectives on this work. We are now really focusing on the reception and also on your interpretation of this work. I think it would be also interesting to know a little bit more on the social and political and cultural context that allow him also to build in this kind of multi-scalar way. No? He designed artifacts, he designed buildings, he designed open space and then public space. I think it would be interesting to know a little bit more concerning the context or the conditions of this freedom that you are describing. Thank you.
Actually, what we showed today mostly is Ljubljana that you saw, but he came to Ljubljana in 1921 from Prague when he started to teach at the school, and most of those works that you saw were done before the Second World War. Only the Crusaders monastery was transformed after the war, so let's say 20 years that he had, and he had the support from the city government, of course. Ljubljana was transformed largely at that time because after the earthquake at the end of the 19th century, there were lots of repairs had to be done, especially National Library, for instance, was built on the place of a palace that was in a bad condition. So, but he had also, for my opinion, a very strong support from the man that was guiding the Institute for Heritage Protection, Frances Tele. He studied with Max Dvorak in Vienna, and he understood his somehow very radical transformational projects that he did. What Maja mentioned, that he did his own context, actually the things that he did with the existing would not have been possible today. Not only the library, but the Roman wall, or the Crusaders monastery, scratching off the plaster, or building above the Skansi walls. This is something that we could not imagine to be capable to do this today. So he had a lot of support of people that somehow saw this is going somehow into a good direction, especially with the public works and the public space, which is, of course, very much appreciated today. You know? We have to admit that we live in the times where public space is opened, also Ljubljana is largely putting out the cars, so now we really see his interventions, and they are somehow grown together with his landscape ideas. I think perhaps we didn't mention so much, but landscape that he was planning and planting is very important part of his projects. So now they are somehow grown into the tissue of the city and allow us also different interpretations, I think, which is actually nice.
I mean, if I just add something to that, you know, Ljubljana was in the 20th century kind of, let's say, the city of two big hands. Plečniks in the 30s and Ravnikar in the 60s and 70s, you know. So, I mean, you have like two very strong, very good master architects who are present in the city. And, you know, these kind of shows, I'm not going to go into psychoanalysis, what it means, you know, but it kind of like shows something, and I'm going to now move to our generation, which we would not, I mean, it shows kind of like completely different social and political context, you know. Like, you know, also the context in the 30s was the context with almost no competition. There was, of course, a competition for the library, you know, but all this, what was presented today was a direct commission, you know. And then, you know, if you ask how we react to that, I mean, how actually our generation reacts to that, was kind of like, is it kind of questioning, you know, is it possible to, with a kind of like very small city, which is sort of, I wouldn't say like loaded with two big hands, you know, to show that you can work there in a very sort of multiple and kind of open and plural approach, you know. And I think this is also the response to Plečnik, you know. It's kind of like showing, okay, I mean, you know, 4 offices, 5 or 6 offices can work there, you know, with a completely different approach, you know. And, you know, this coexistence, you know, creates a completely different context, you know, which is not the context of one hand.
I'm really not an expert. I don't know. I just visited some of the wonderful works of Plečnik. I'm just wondering, it's quite an interesting question, how much power he had and how much he was able to convince also in a political setting, maybe to operate in such a wider range and also in different cities. And so the question is that, is it related to a pan-Slavic movement, or like redefining open space, public space, and architecture as a tool to address maybe such a project?
Maybe this was more present perhaps in the project of Prague, where he was invited by President Masaryk at the time when the Czech Republic was somehow establishing and somehow came to live in the Hradčany castle. And the project that he did there actually had to do with bringing the democracy and showing the democracy with the open space. So in the Hradčany castle, for instance, he opened the inner squares for the public, and he plastered the squares and rearranged all these transitional ways through these inner courtyards to allow the society to enter and then to go to the gardens and then to see to the city. So this was a gesture of democratization of one state of Czechoslovakia. For Ljubljana, I'm not really sure that he had this kind of political thing in mind, but I can only say that the gestures I showed with this poor sketch that I showed, somehow they were not planned like gestures, but today they are perceived like alleys that give this city a bigger dimension. Ljubljana actually is really a very, very small city. And through this, opening the spaces and connecting it from, let's say, the house where he lived and the church to the southern square on the north side, he's creating with the articulation of the space, not with like an alley, but with the trees mostly, and with some buildings, a cultural axis with student programs, and giving this city another dimension. With these open spaces, Ljubljana became somehow a city, I can say.
But it was also a test ground, you know. I mean, he tested, you know, and I mean, Ljubljana with a kind of like a critical mass was manageable, you know. And also with a critical mass, not just in terms of square meters, but also in terms of inhabitants and people who are there to decide and to govern, it was actually possible to develop the city as a proper testing ground, and it was successful, you know. So I mean, one could speculate if Plečnik would have stayed in Prague, you know, if this would actually continue in that way, or in Vienna, you know, where the condition is completely different, you know, or in Berlin, you know. So it was understanding the scale and what one can do in that scale. And as Maruša put it, you know, all his activity there completely transformed the image of the city on a completely different scale, you know.
I think the biggest frustration of all of us in our generation is that we haven't met him. We haven't interviewed him because he's such an enigma, you know, because if you look at this path, in fact, that Maruša explained, it's also his personal path. He walked from his house to the city that way, and he built a little tobacco shop because he liked to smoke and he wanted to have it there because if he ran out of cigarettes. So it's a kind of mix of this personal, I would say, ways of creating he made the city for walking, for walkers, to walk through the city, to experience it with your body. And also the interventions that he has are in fact a kind of mistakes in the public space, mistakes in the sense that you encounter a column in the middle of staircase that you need to avoid. You're always alert, always in fact feel your body when you experience Plečnik. And there is another side which I think is quite unresearched yet, is Plečnik as businessman. Because when you asked how come that he built so much, it was of course the support of the mayor, it was support of Stele, but he must have had some kind of communication skills to convince people to in fact go with him, and did this in fact quite huge transformations in the city. Yeah.
Yes, Saša.
Regarding his relationship towards the church and sacral architecture, how is this present in all of his projects, maybe, and what was his role after the Second World War, because it changed a little bit, maybe. Yeah.
Just to kind of like jump in here, it was very interesting, you know, like 15 years ago when we prepared, you know, this publication on, it's called Plečnik 2007, you know, we did like a chart, you know, of typologies of works of Plečnik, you know, from, you know, his early years to the late years, you know, and it was interesting to see, you know, that after the Second World War, you know, he would work, you know, on partisan monuments, Christian baptisterium, you know, like stones in small interventions in the city. So it's not that one will say, okay, Plečnik was only a religious Catholic architect working only for churches, but he would actually work on, you know, monument to the victims of the Second World War, you know, with the sort of, I'm speculating now, with the same kind of passion, you know.
What connects his public space and the church is the ritual, because that he did something that he in fact imagines, predicts, thinks about how you enter. I mean, the succession of spaces now, the scenography of the space, and that in fact the ritual of entering the church and entering the city. You see that he puts a lot of emphasis in it, and it's kind of common denominator.
I also have to add to this what you said, because also in this sense I find his work in a way somehow generous or open, because although he was considered really Catholic and so strict and so closed, and his church spaces are in conceptual sense very modern. Actually, they are pre-modern, because he constructed large churches. They are so-called long churches because of the long ritual that happens inside them, but they are very large. And only in 1965, that was 8 years after his death, the Vatican Council decided to create large churches, to open and bring the audience closer to the priest, that he was somehow before his time with his concepts of these wide spaces that bring audience closer to the altar. So in this sense of the ritual and the concept of the space, he was also modern in a certain way.
Sasha, by the way, the next session would be like in about 15 minutes, like according to plan, like 6:30. Is there a little bit of a pause in the program, right? About 15 minutes. So we could stop here, and as we stay together and also socialize a little bit for drinks, maybe I would stop it here and allow for a break, for the change of the setting, for the next moderators. But I want to thank you, all the three of you, for your contributions. I have to say, when I opened up and also listened to Marusha's talk, and when I opened up your slides, I really thought I have to go to Ljubljana again, because this the plasticity, how you work with terrain, how you work with connections within the city, how you work with the topography, and how you work this also from a detail up into a kind of territorial understanding of the side of a town. I have to say, I did not see that when I was there. So, Boštjan, next time we have to again. So thank you very much. Thank you. Ah, yeah, okay. And now we have to make a photograph, like the four of us speakers.
I think we should start now. So welcome to the second section. The topic is Unheimlich, Uncanny. And my name is Lidia Gasperoni. I'm a research and teaching associate at the Technical University in Berlin, this Institute for the Chair of Architectural Theory, and I'm really glad to moderate this section. I like also to mention that the ambassador of Slovenia and Germany, Anna Polar-Petris, is here with us, and we're really glad to welcome you and to present also the second session and to discuss also with you and trying to reflect together on this attempt also to make this work of Petric timely and to understand also the reason why this work is also in your sense timely today. And we have in the second section 4 interesting perspectives, also very different, and I think we will also benefit from these different perspectives. On the one side from the architectural theory, and then from the architectural history, and then from the architectural practice, and also the intersection between spatial practice and art through our 4 guests. And we start with Jörg Gleiter, and we are starting also with a reflection on Uncanny, and we just also discussing a little bit in our break concerning the decision to find a concept of, or select a concept of Uncanny for this section, and Boštjan will also saying that this idea of Unheimlich is also linked to the question of nicht heimlich, and something that is not familiar, something that is not really related to something that a resemblance to something that is homely, and then we have also the other term that is uncanny, and I think also Jörg Gleiter will introduce some aspects concerning the second sections. I will really make a very brief presentation of our guests in order to really make the experience of the presentation and then also to discuss together. Jörg Gleiter is an architectural theorist. He's the head of the Department of Architectural Theory at the Institute of Architecture at the Technical University in Berlin. And from 2005 to until 2012, he was professor of aesthetics at the Faculty of Arts and Design of the Free University of Bolzano in Italy, and there are of course several publications that characterize his work. I like to mention the recent publication Architekturtheorie zur Einführung, published 2022 in Yunus Verlag, and there are also of course several publications concerning the architectural theory, semiotics, the new topics also of the Anthropocene, of the climate emergency and climate change, and today, it will also introduce the topic for Uncanny, related, of course, to Plečnik. So, Jörg, you have the stage. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, good afternoon, or maybe good evening. At the beginning of my presentation, please let me ask you a question. Is Joseph Plečnik's architecture humorous? Is it even ironic? Or would it be rather the opposite, that it is dark and perhaps uncanny or unheimlich? How does this work? Okay. So, a conference in Ljubljana only recently addressed Plečnik's architecture under the concept of humor. This continues the interpretation and appropriation of Plečnik by postmodernity, when one has believed to have found in Plečnik an accomplice and ally for the new lightness of being. The Unbearable Lightness of Being was the title actually of Miloš Kundera's 1984 novel, which summed up the zeitgeist of that years. In 1994 also saw the opening of James Stirling's Neue Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, a work that shares many aspects with Plečnik's architecture and yet is totally different. Then in 1986, there was the already mentioned retrospective at the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris. But Plečnik's architecture can hardly be called humorous, I would say. It does exactly not possess the lightness that is characteristic of humor. Neither does it possess the postmodern lightness. Is it then perhaps ironic? Friedrich Nietzsche once described irony very appropriately with the sentence that he prefaced his book Ecce Homo. Ridendo dicere severum is written there, or lovingly saying the serious. This is the task of irony, actually. And it is the task of the fool, as Nietzsche tells us, who runs at daylight through the market with a lantern, saying what everyone has known for a long time, but does not dare to say, God is dead. However, we know from Plečnik that he was very devout, or rather downright God-fearing, in his younger years already. From Damian Prelovsek, the author of a biography of Plečnik, we know that Plečnik read mainly serious literature in his Viennese years, for example. And because of Nietzsche's criticism of religion, but also because of the ironic sharpness of Nietzsche's texts, Plečnik is said to have had a pronounced dislike for Nietzsche, although Plečnik's architecture is in no way inferior to Nietzsche's works in terms of ambivalence, ambiguity, and this abysmality. At the end of my short lecture, however, the possibility will indeed emerge that Plečnik, despite everything, was much closer to Nietzsche than he may ever have admitted to himself. But the dark and abysmal in Plečnik feeds on other sources. The motives and intentions of effect are different. It is the procedure opposed to irony that characterizes Plečnik's architecture, best described by the aesthetic category that Sigmund Freud, the inventor of psychoanalysis, introduced into aesthetics at the time when Plečnik was in Vienna. It is the aesthetic category of the Uncanny, das Unheimliche. So Plečnik's architecture is indeed irritating. This is the least one can agree on about his multi-layered and ambivalent architecture. Yes, for all its enlightenment, Plečnik's architecture has something dark about it. And if you look at the University Library, for example, St. Michael's Church, but also the development of the market alongside of the Ljubljanica River, and many other buildings, you can shake the feeling of the facades show as much as they hide, or in other words, that under the surfaces there lays hidden something dark. This is especially true of the classicist elements to which Plečnik returned again and again. They hide more than they show. If we define classicism as the style in architecture, in which everything is subject to rational control, if classicism is considered the epitome of enlightenment, and if classicism stands for the age of reason, Plečnik's interest seems to be in the other of reason, actually. That is, in the irrational, the ambiguous, the unfathomable, and that which is suppressed under the surface. And this brings us back to postmodernism, as their interest was in the other side of reason, and in that which reason must suppress, but in which it is ultimately founded. Plečnik's interest was in the other of reason as well, the mythical, mystical, and religious undercurrents of architecture or of culture at large. We would also call it the backside of reason. The other of reason was actually the title of a book by Gernot and Hartmut Böhme. It came out also in 1985. So we can say that the postmodern, insofar as its interest in Plečnik went much deeper, it concerned precisely not the humorous and the surface, but that which is suppressed, that which shuns the light. That is precisely what is disturbing about Plečnik's architecture, just as it is that what is exciting about his architecture. In Plečnik's architecture, there are rational struggles with the abysmal and the mythical. And between the visible and the invisible emerges the uncanny. In his seminal essay on the same name, Sigmund Freud called the uncanny the neglected concept of aesthetics. The uncanny is that which is repressed in the depth of the soul, but which, I quote, should remain a secret, hidden, and yet has emerged, end of quote. Freud makes examples for this from literature, from E.T.H. Hoffmann, from Shakespeare, from Greek mythology, and also psychoanalysis. While Freud thematizes the uncanny in connection with narcissism, dreams, madness, and castration fears, he only briefly mentions the uncanny house, but he mentions it. But he does not go further into the concept of the uncanny in architecture. One has the feeling that Plečnik was needed to complement Freud's concept of the architectural uncanny. In the terms of psychoanalysis, the uncanny can be interpreted as the return of the repressed. In the uncanny, then, the repressed shows itself, but it emerges to the surface in a changed form, quasi in disguise or mask-like. Here Nietzsche returns again. For him, architecture, and especially classicism, was mask-like. And he wrote, quotation, "Beauty entered the system, that is architecture, only incidentally, without significantly affecting the basic sensation of the uncanny sublime. Beauty at most mitigated the horror, but horror was everything the prerequisite. What is the beauty of a building to us now?" he asks in his seminal aphorism, and the answer is something mask-like. The task of the architect is now to bring to visibility the uncanny, the mask-likeness, the ambivalences between the rational and the irrational. And I think Plečnik's architecture is full of this tension. But while the psychoanalyst, like Freud, is interested in uncovering the mask or what is behind, in looking analytically behind it, it is the task of the architect or the artist to make in his designs experienceable the ambivalences between the visible and the non-visible, the rational and the non-rational. Architecture does not bring the repressed to light, but allows it to shine through the surface. In Plečnik's architecture, one can participate in the struggle of the unconscious and the conscious, in the uncanny with the secret, the mask with what it conceals. If we now define modernism in the sense of Sigmund Freud as that attitude of mind which makes the struggle between the unconscious and the conscious its theme, In this sense, then Plečnik is a modern architect. But given his obsession with the uncanny, he's perhaps more of a, let me say, maybe Viennese architect or a modern Slovenian architect in the Viennese tradition, psychoanalytical tradition. And now, let's have a look at the lock or floodgate of Ljubljanica River. Here, the uncanny turns into the grotesque, undermining the classical order and classicist rationality. A Doric column is crowned by an Ionic capital with a volute to both sides. But the capital is replaced by a mask, and that transforms the volutes into horns, actually. As a whole, the figure then takes on the shape of a ram, with which Plečnik takes up a mythological, ancient motif. And the ram stands for the drives, for the repression, and the return of the repressed. The motif is then repeated in the library. With the mask and classicism, we are on the semiotic side of the uncanny. So on the side of the signs, figures, meaning, and the pictorial. With the facade of the library building, however, on the other hand, we are on the phenomenological side of the uncanny. We see bricks in combination with different stones of various forms of smooth, rough, and rusticating surfaces. On the one hand, Cyclopean masonry, as it is known from the oldest city complexes in Greece from the 2nd millennium before Christ. On the other hand, industrially manufactured rational bricks. Bricks, smooth and striated. Actually, the smooth and the striated were two terms introduced into aesthetics, on the one hand by the philosopher Deleuze and the psychoanalyst Guattari, and they wrote a famous book about it. And even the windows are not cutouts in the facade, but spill out, like the rusticating natural stones. One has the impression that behind the facade there is an unknown force at work, an uncanny force that comes to the surface from the unconscious, from the dark, and from the hidden side of life. Thank you very much.
Yeah, many thanks. I think it became clear that through the uncanny we will investigate other aspects of the work of Plečnik. So many thanks also for this first presentation. And now we have the second presentation from the perspective also of the history of architecture. Luka Skansi is an architectural historian, is an associate professor of the Politecnico di Milano in Italy. And his research interests include in particular Italian architecture and engineering of the 20th century, but he has also very particular expertise in the architecture of socialist Yugoslavia and Russia and Soviet architecture. In this sense, there are many intersections also from the regional perspective, and you have many, I think, relationships also to Slovenia and to also Croatia. And he was a visiting scholar at many institutions, so in Montreal and in Belgrade, in Venezuela. I will not mention her experience, but your work is also very interesting, and the intersection between the architectural historical reflection and many different also forms of exhibition, for example, for the Venice Biennale, and also in the recent work for the curatorial staff of the exhibition of Fiume Fantastica. That was a very interesting also work in Rijeka in Croatia. And for this reason, I think it's also interesting to know a little bit more concerning also your approach to Plečnik and also your expertise in describing also many architects and architectural works, as for example also in the Italian tradition as Carlo Scalpa, Aldo Rossi, Pierluigi Nervi, and so on. So you have the stage for the presentation also of your perspective concerning Plečnik. Welcome.
Thank you, Lidia. Maybe I should stay down, up, or maybe. Yeah, would be easier. Thank you, Lidia, for the wonderful presentation, and thank you all. It's a great privilege to be here and an honor to have the possibility to speak about Plečnik in such a wonderful place. I have just 15 minutes, so I will read. I'm not able to but I'll be very clear. There is a very particular space, very important for the Slovenian architectural culture, and it is the entrance to the memorial in Kampor on the island of Rab, the grave of hundreds of Slovenians died during the fascist occupation, where an Italian concentration camp stood once. The author is Edvard Ravnikar. We mentioned him today a couple of times, for sure the most prominent scholar of Jože Plečnik. And what strikes me always when I visit this place is absolutely the level of relationality that we as perceivers have when we enter into it. We are in the entrance of this complex in a kind of transitional space where we encounter a series of objects, a series of symbolic elements, a series of inscriptions that evoke a sort of rational, concrete, material testimony of the history, what happened, what occurred on this spot, and etc. But this space is framed by a thick drywall that has a strong contextual materiality. And this stone is exposed almost in an excessive and almost dramatic manner. But through a series of interruptions, openings, it is possible to capture also the surroundings. Seems banal, but there is a graveyard, subsequent architectural events like sculptures, obelisks, and then the scale of the landscape, so the Adriatic Bay, the Mediterranean vegetation. So this capacity of contemplating into the same site, into the same space, the multiplicity of relations, and at the same time keeping the strong autonomy of this transitional space, is for me extremely suggestive and inspired, and always inspired my curiosity, especially because it brings to the question and to the crucial aspect of the contemplation of the memory, brings it into a complex interactive experience between landscape, the artifact, and us that are perceiving this story. What I like to think is that this device or this spatial strategy and relational dimension and this complexity of this relationality has been learned by Ravnikar from the experience of the spaces of Le Corbusier. Ravnikar worked in the studio, in the atelier office in Rue de Sèvres by Le Corbusier in 1939. And what I like to think is that he interiorized two specific lessons given by Le Corbusier. The first one is the richness of the relationality that we perceive inside the entrance space of Maison La Roche. A vertical space with a very strong identity, with a strong character, but a transitional space. A space substantially without a function, around which all different activities of the house are taking place. A space that is characterized by planes, by perforated walls, by openings, by sources of light, by elements that are all completely undermining and actually erasing any idea of centrality of any kind of space, but providing, on contrary, for a series of visual relations with contiguous, adjoining spaces, inviting us to the movement, inviting us to the perception, and of course to the dynamic perception of architecture. The second lecture that I would like to think that Ravnikar took from Le Corbusier is the lecture of the post-war Le Corbusier, and in particular the transition away from the abstract, dematerialized substance of surfaces to the rough, brutal, natural treatment. A shift that is perfectly embodied in this sculpture, in the Ubu sculptures, in the sculptural works of the 1940s. Sculptures that avoid the composition of a single figure, but are constituted by a series of bodies, a series of elements, suspended in a reciprocal, again, spatial relationship. This material exposure, so important for not only, but we are talking about Ravnikar, so important for Ravnikar, becomes narration. So materiality becomes narration, but narration in space. And again, in relationality between objects, spaces, and of course us, fundamental, and our position, our observation while we are moving around the sculpture. No? The bodies change in their relationship. All these thematics, all these obsessions that in fact transmute into architectural tricks, into artistic tricks, into devices, are already all present in Plečnik. And as you have seen till now, in a series of infinite number of examples, I will choose one, for me, from the point of view of this perceptive game, probably the most astonishing. In a small village of Begunje, we are in the periphery of Slovenia, Plečnik designed a small wooden pavilion for the rest of the nuns of the local convent. The pavilion is positioned on the border between an open field and a forest. We approach it by slowly climbing up the path leading to the forest. When we are in front, actually, we read it as an object, as it was always interpreted, a kind of allegory of Zemper's primordial hut. No? This is kind of rational reading of this object, which absolutely is. But it is definitely also, at the same time, quite a reductive interpretation, as becomes evident when we are starting to do what we have talked before, and that is walking and entering into it, like around the sculptures of Le Corbusier, like going through the transitional space of Edvard Ravnikar. So we realize this when we enter under the covered space, surrounded by these 6 wide trucks that carry the roof. The spatial effect is almost impossible to describe in words. Through the pavilion, at the very edge of the forest, thanks to this artifact, the pavilion, the trunks, at one point we drown into the forest. And we are not talking about a canonical observation of a nice landscape through a pergola. No, it's not this. No? We actually fall into the forest, but without doing so, and we are standing in the pavilion. And the role of this rough materiality of the trucks is crucial. It is not simply a contextual gesture. It is not merely evoking the urhute, no? But begins to act as a spatial device, a transitional one, that connects us with the forest landscape. In an instance, just in 1 second, we experience the interaction between the natural environment, the artifact pavilion, and us. My very simple point today, and I'm concluding with this, is that through all his career, Plečnik worked on incredibly complex links between the different scales of space. urban spaces, landscapes, architectural, and so on, and created incredible interactive effects that brought to a synthesis of the various elements that make up this, what we call experience of space. And the fundamental element of this triangle between landscape, artifact, and us is really us as perceivers, fundamental in the idea of the architecture of Plečnik. And this idea, this methodology, you know, as a perceptive, empathetic process, represents the roots of modernity. A modernity with, in fact, we still are still living in it. Thank you.
Then I have to go down again. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I think it's also an interesting transition point to the idea of a spatial device and also a spatial intervention. As we have with the next two presentations, I think the possibility to go really a little bit much more in depth concerning the question of a spatial device, a spatial intervention, dealing with architectural practices, also the boundary between artifacts, buildings, and urban space, and different forms of interacting with space, because the two next presentations are the presentation of Jürgen and Maja, Olaf, Nicolai, and I'm really glad also to present, first of all, of course, Jörg and Maja, was an architect engaged in spatial research and building practice. After studying architecture, sorry, I have to just adapt the micro because it's falling. Okay. Yeah, it's okay. It's fine. Yeah, danke. Sorry. After studying architecture at the University of Stuttgart, the Cooper Union University in New York, of course, and Princeton University, Maja founded his Berlin office in 1996, and in 2014, Andreas Santer and Anne Schneider also joined as partners. Jürgen Maja and partner is a nationally and internationally recognized architectural practice working at the interface of architecture, communication design, and new technologies. I also like to mention that he worked also in cooperative teams, also trying to find a kind of and develop also a multidisciplinary spatial research on the relationship between body, nature, and technology, also analyzing movements in the city, trying to find also a way to link installation with urban planning, designs, and competitions. Maja Hartners relies, of course, a wide range of different projects worldwide since its foundation, and I like to mention the most prominent project, that is the international recognized Metropole Parasol, which is the redesign of the Plaza de la Encarnación in Seville, in Spain. And there are currently many projects that you are building also in Düsseldorf and Potsdam, in downtown in Berlin. And 2020, you also received the award for the Design of the Year 2020 as a part of the annual also Design Week of Sao Paulo. So you have the stage now, and we are of course very curious also to know much more concerning your work and the relationship to Plečnik. Many thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and maybe I have the shortest way to get here. I just live 5 minutes away walking, so this is very comfortable as a symposium spot, very comfortable. So we are in the neighborhood. I think adding kind of a different approach to Plečnik, coming from somehow very, let's say, naive or intuitional introduction to Plečnik in 1988 or something like this, when I was studying in Stuttgart and Boris Podreka just became one of the professors. Of course, you know, my generation maybe was a little bit beyond postmodernism, so when we heard Plečnik, we also got a little bit of excited and curious, like, why do we need to look at this person? You know, we are somehow beyond that period. Little did we know, because once we were seduced into looking at his work, there was so much richness, and also kind of around that time we made a study trip to Prague and Brno with our city planning professor, and this is also when I saw the first Plečnik building in real life as a material in front of me, which was this church here in Prague. I'm showing you all this building, and it already has all these kind of strange elements that doesn't really make sense, or you have to figure it out because it questions a lot of standards and hierarchies that you're trained as a student are correct and proper and kind of construct architecture, space and materiality. If you go to this church, you see this wall that's leaning out. You walk up the tower, which has this strange Charlie Chaplin feel, but inside it looks like a ramp in Villa Savoie in Corbusier's house. So all these clashes of different things, that doesn't make sense. You know, there's a freedom of combinations, assemblage. We heard all of this before. And there was so much inspirations, but also more questions, like how did he come up with this? Why was it possible? How dare he design it that way? You know, how he confronted these materials. So a lot of problems that were created in front of you, but these problems were all solved they force you to be creative in a different way. So when and I would like to show today with this presentations 2 works of our office, or that we designed and built, that were somehow inspired by the curiosity of 2 kind of projects in Plečnik's work, which were basically one-to-one inspirations, takeovers, appropriations, when it felt right to actually look at it and make it our own, my own. The first project was a winning competition scheme for a town hall in Stuttgart. And part of like the design process, the building became kind of leaning back. There was a dynamization of this public space. It was kind of a letter weight, you know, to place this public space in a, at this point, still to be developed city part, or a new city based on an American military site. But with these angled walls, of course, there comes this problem of making windows into this wall, which was not just a regular wall. And at that point, somehow this facade came back by Plečnik, where once this wall was tilting out, these sticking out stones became these hanging like little drops on a kind of an inclined plane, as I found the solution how we can deal with windows. And so, just very simple, that's how it turned into a window in our town hall in Stuttgart. These hanging glass sheets out of this inclined facade that you see here even more in detail. Sorry, the images are a little blurry. Another view from the other side, and maybe here it's a little bit easier to understand how this inclined works. So there's a relief that started to be created by, you know, creating a problem which is an angled wall, and then once you have a glass that is angled, you need different security systems because it has to be prevented from falling down, etc., etc. So this was somehow a solution, just taking over from Plečnik's design process. The second house that I felt was very curious is this little tiny house that was not built by Plečnik, which, you know, also I looked at it and said, what happened here? It's a very tiny house with an inclined roof. There are columns, but they grow with the height of the sloped ceiling. Actually, the first moment I thought about it was the Slowhow by Scofidio, which is a very similar layout in plan and also in the section where you open up this whole building with the roof, and there's a huge picture window here where you look into the landscape. I felt this was also a very strong proposition to deal with inclined roofs and structures and columns or structural elements that started and also play with the tilted slope of the roof. And this turned into a reference in our dining hall in Karlsruhe, where you see kind of a one-to-one kind of dialogue of a reference project, which catches your eye because it's so untrained as it was designed. It's somehow unlearning the language that you were told is correct in order to create something new that's irritating, that causes a certain, let's say, second look, a knick in the optic, if you like it. I couldn't find an English translation of it, where this kind of blurred vision turns into a second look, and I think that second look is the first moment where it becomes your own, where there's an appropriation and trying to understand happening in the viewer. So I tried to analyze why I thought this was so interesting and so curious. And there are a couple of procedures, design procedures that we all learned earlier today in our presentations that are returning in his work. And I'm sure there are a lot of specialists and theoreticians who know much more about these things. So one is this idea of shifting, and this is one of the big churches, the large spaces that we heard today, where these columns are supposed to be kind of ordering the space, but yet they jump back and forth, or they're sliding back and forth. So there's a dynamic spatial configuration within a very clear kind of tectonic layout that was then transformed and modified. The second one I called offsetting, where either you just have one column and you offset it, and there's like a doubling happening, a doubling effect where you start to understand, is my vision a little like off focus, or is this kind of happening? At the same time, these bridges where you have the same element and all of a sudden one jumps down and there's already a reference to the lower level of the city river. We heard about these kind of very subtle spatial and layering techniques earlier today in talks of Boštjan and other people. I liked this strategy of softening, where again tectonic elements or proper geometric elements become transformed, fused, and let's say continuing from one into the other. Here, these hanging lamps, or the column that is based on stacking spheres on top of each other, and then they become actually one. And the last one, I think, is this idea of warping, where you have this one roof in the castle in Prague, and at the same time, on the other hand, this very rustic wall that kind of bends out, and you feel there's a thickness, there's some kind of a womb, there's like something breathing inside that wants to get out. So this is somehow my reference to a couple of, let's say, untraditional destabilizations of expectations that I see in his work, which we might now these days in our discourse call maybe the querying of architecture in a contemporary way. It's rethinking hierarchies and orders in order to actually find a more fluid, a more transitional way of looking into our spaces for a future possibility. Thank you.
Thank you also for destabilizing orders, and we will, I think, discuss also later concerning this point, so please also make your notes and consideration, because we will also discuss together now after the fourth presentation. And I'm going to present Olaf Nicolai. It's not so easy to present this work because it's so complex and so also interesting, crossing many spatial scales and also many artistic and spatial practices. So many thanks also for being here and to be part today of our section concerning the work of Plečnik. And Olaf Nicolai is a German artist working at the intersection between spatial scale, sensory and dimension, but also deep cultural reflections. And it's not easy to mention all your exhibitions. I can say you have a background, of course, also in humanities with a PhD on the Wiener Gruppe, and then you really explore many different cultural dimensions through also spatial interventions, and you have several exhibitions and solo exhibitions around the world. In Chemnitz, in Melbourne, in Wien, in Innsbruck, so I cannot mention. every exhibition, but outlining that you're also crossing many different practices and also dimension in perceptions, like for example in music theater piece, trying also form to develop performative installations, finding also a way to conceive memorial, to find a way also to really build intervention for new, for example, for interior design, for the new buildings of the Meisterhäuser, also the Bauhaus Dessau. So there are really several aspects, multi-layer reflection on space and the way also we could use spatial intervention to cross in also different cultural dimension. And many thanks for being also part of our second section, and then we will also discuss together. Many thanks.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I want to talk briefly about two projects which have a very direct link to Plečnik's work. One of the works I want to start with is now like back more than 23 years. The first piece of Plečnik what I have seen, I did not realize that it's a piece by him. When I was a kid with my parents, we visited quite often Prague in the castle. So I was walking around there and I just encountered it. And so I never had an idea that I saw the work of an architect. I just saw the castle. And then later, a friend from Slovenia took me very proud to the Herz-Jesu-Kirche in Prague and showed it to me as it was something amazing for him just that he can show it to me. And it was really also something, I knew the church before, but I did not have connected it to the name of Plečnik too much. And I was also inside the church because it was a vivid point of meeting for alternative and oppositional people in Prague at that time. So then the work, then I finally had a chance to visit Ljubljana and Slovenia, and again I was not so much interested in Plečnik first, because the most things what I was interested in were bees. When you come to Slovenia, the bee plays quite an important role. And I was very surprised to find all these kind of dedicated beekeepers there. And also there's the first museum I've seen there was the Museum for Bees. So, and also if you look at the currency, there's the bee. And then you go to the flea market and then there are all these little details for the bee houses. So you see the connection of architecture and landscape and economy on a very simple level. And I was very happy when I then studied slowly the work of Plečnik. I found this work by him, what he designed and executed for the farm of Masaryk, the Czech president. It's a bee house. And I was invited to an exhibition and for outdoor landscape in Luxembourg. And then I said, okay, architects and bees, this seems to be a quite interesting relation. So I just had this thing in mind, and then by Fourier, the Falastre, you know, the coming together of workers. Then what you know maybe here in Berlin, Le Corbusiers and Melnikov's flying. So, and I invited architects and asked them, could you give me a design for a bee house? And I will execute a bee house. So, and then I chose 4 architects, so 3 of them, which at that time were very responsible for changing the landscape of Berlin. This is by Sauerbruch and Hatten, the bee house. This is, and at that time, quite unknown architectural team B&K Plus, which is Arno Brandelhuber and Bernd Knies. And the plus was because they collaborated a lot with very different people, and they had a very interesting way of thinking how an architect could be just an intersection of a lot of practices. Then this was by Ortner and Ortner, which turned out that they are beekeepers themselves, so they were the only one who could explain to me that what you see here, these are stones, and you need the stones that the ants cannot get up to the bees. So there were all these little details, and then that was Sauerbruch Hatten again, and this was Josef Paul Kleihues. So all of them came up with their own language. The most interesting thing for me was I had to communicate their proposals to the beekeepers. So I had all the time to say, okay, listen, this is what they propose, and how does it work for you? And then they explained, yeah, this is good, but you know, this is nuts. So I had to get back, can we change that? Can we do this differently? So it was quite an interesting way of getting to know how architects are designing according to images. And when the function is getting in, what happens then to the image? So this was the project. And the important thing, when it is exhibited, it needs a beekeeper. All these houses need beekeepers. So when I show these pieces, there are bees there. At that time, it was extremely difficult to find beekeepers. 23 years ago, there was not a fashion of beekeeping at that time, and what it is now. So at that time, the 2 beekeepers I found, they were making their money with therapeutic sessions for people who had rheuma, that they got beaten by bees, not with honey. So, and yes. Of course, you have a lot of things what you can think about in terms of theory of architecture and the relation to nature, and also the idea of an ideal state, what role architectures are playing in. And I still remember at that time I was quite fascinated by this quite rough term by Le Corbusier, good architecture or revolution. So a little bit short term. I know that I paraphrase it not correctly. So when you go to Plečnik's house in Ljubljana, of course you find a bee house. I was told that this was not directly designed by him, so I would not say it's... But I show you this now because I come to the second project, which will start next week in Ljubljana, in the house of Jörg Plečnik, where you will have... What you see here is the invitation to an exhibition, what I organized together with a curator from Rome, Luka Lupinto. And we got a chance that we could use the house as a host for different inventions. And when we had this idea, of course we needed to find a concept, what to do. And finally, at a moment, after studying Plečnik's life, his way, how he is using the house, I got to know the encounter with the housekeeper. He had a very, very special housekeeper, a wife who was extremely dedicated to him. And so I read you now the concept, what we developed for that. Dear Jörg, I'm only the housekeeper, but I don't know. Today I met 2 men who visited your house. They spent a lot of time here and loved your place. They asked if it would be possible to add some small objects in your house which would join your own things for a little while and keep them company. They said something like strange things. Things could talk to things, which I thought was odd, but quite touching. I told them right away that you probably wouldn't like that. I just couldn't imagine you will liking it. But then they wouldn't stop talking about you and the house. During the conversation, when I had made them some tea, they suddenly asked me to share things I would have to suggested you. Just small possible changes and thoughts I may have had, and that would try to come up with in ways in which these ideas, wishes and gestures could be presented to you. At first I thought, oh no. I remember what happened when one time with the toilet, I couldn't stop the city council from installing a flush toilet in your absence. They assumed it would have pleased you. I will never forget your drastic comment, I want to hear the shit false. You said shit, and then everything had to be removed. No, after such an incident, I swore to myself that I would never ever let it happen again, and I never want to hear these words ever again by you. Yet after the conversation, I started to think, why shouldn't we make some changes? Could it be a good idea? And I really started to give it some thought. You know, I have always kept a low profile, and I tried to be obtrusively a caretaker of the house, to be close to your wishes, to make sure that everything was in place, so that you could go about your work in peace. Nonetheless, I had some ideas, and sometimes I thought about the possibility of changing this or that in the house and in the garden. I don't mean big changes, not even renovations, just small things, signs, gestures, even just suggestions. They came back the following day, and we decided to keep the conversation going, to share our thoughts with each other. So I admit that we start working together, and you will find your house a bit changed. You will also hear some stories. Please don't be afraid or grumpy. Maybe you will see it the way as I do. As a starting point, we don't know for what yet, or where it will lead us to. Those who will see it, hopefully, understand that things can be a certain way, and they can also be a very different way. Imagine the church tower next door did not only strike every hour on the dot, but also 9 minutes after noon. So if you come to Ljubljana, then you maybe see this show, and there are 25 interventions, not only by artists. One, for example, which I'm very happy about, is one of the best Slovenian cooks agreed that she gives a recipe for all the what is placed based on all the things what you find in the garden of Plečnik. But because you can visit the house only with a tour, the recipe will be told to you. You cannot write it down. You must remember it. So, thank you very much.
So 4 different perspectives, I would say, with some points also of intersection. So I like also to open the discussion if you have any general questions or comments, or also to the group or to one person, feel free to put your question or raise your hand. We'll give you the mic. I think it's not so easy to make a general comment concerning the first presentations. My impression was that we are moving now in a kind of tension, also new topics. On the one side, we are addressing the question of language and of science, of the possibility of reversing logics and orders, to use also the language to, in a sense, finding a new form of ordering forms. And on the other side, we also had the opportunity to approach to this form as a new way also of understanding orders and interpretation as a form of environmental transformations. So there was also this link to go inside into the architecture, to also trying to understand the forms not just from the outside as in your presentation, but got really into the pavilion, then discovering that these signs and also the different form of signs in form of maybe columns and also new semantics is also something that is hidden in a new space of the experience. And we ended also with a new dimension of the experience of these, for example, of the house and also of the architectural form. And I think there is maybe one question that I think is also relevant for the way we are now discussing together the architecture of Plečnik, but also for our students. There was a very interesting and simple, I think, question, but very complex at the same time, that also Olaf was putting during the presentation. How architects are designing according to images. And that is something that is present in these 4 presentations. So how are you designing according images, according forms? They're not just forms. They stand for something different. Maybe you could say something concerning these topics. So forms are maybe in this sense environmental makers or markers or not?
I think designing or creating doesn't come in one clear strategy. There is always a trial and error. There's a search process, there are references, there's testing, and of course there's post-rationalization. And at some point there's maybe an intuition that it feels right or it feels rightly off, but in a precise way. And then you start to understand why it does it that way. But I don't think that you can kind of be clear from the very beginning where you want to go. This is, at least not for me, a process that works. You can set out a certain system, and then the system kind of guides you to maybe a specific aesthetic result, but then you created a system and you're not really responsible, for how the end result looks like, but you're responsible for the process, and therefore also, of course, witness the outcome. But I think the Plečnik is interesting because he has a certain catalog or vocabulary that allows you to find strategies within your own problems to solve basically the problems that you created yourself, and the freedom that he allows you, to explore, I think is really liberating, and that's why I can relate to Plečnik as a place of discovery rather than somebody who tells me what I need to do, or like what's right and wrong. I mean, I'm going, to Slovenia now for the last 20 years, basically. And I remember Boštjan, he was in that phase where he's like, don't mention Plečnik, I have nothing to do with this person. We are a new generation. Right? I'm right. And it's actually the first time I heard today that he was the first one trying to kind of bring a new approach to Plečnik and reintroduce him to maybe a younger generation. But I understand, that there is, especially in a city like Slovenia, a need of maybe multiplicity, because it's such a kind of a conformed society. Everybody knows each other. Like you go on the street, there's always greetings and hellos. Like there's always kind of a social familiarity, which is, can be kind of imprisoning. At the same time, also it feels very comfortable. And I think that tension that is there, which you might have in Berliner Kiez is a little bit maybe, but not as extreme as it is, when generations know each other and exactly, who comes from which family and who married whom and who divorced whom and all the kind of the family tragedies that happen there. I think that's what I see as a conflict also in Plečnik work. There's a lot of familiarity and there's a lot of conflict, and I think that's a very interesting tension.
Well, I have to confess, after now all these speeches, I have a suspicion that maybe Plečnik was not as free as his architecture looks like. So there could be two approaches to his architecture. Either, call him a kind of deconstructivist, somehow starting from the rational and then breaking it down, open up certain, fissures or gaps in the rational of the classicism and so on, and working in these kind of holes, let's say. Or maybe that, and I'm not yet sure about it, but maybe Plečnik was one who was fighting for order. That is, he was fighting for order, but not being able to accept somehow the ideal order, This is the reverse, somehow, approach to design. And I get not, there's this suspicion that he maybe, it looks free, and maybe it's also for architects today, it's a source for freedom, for freeing up, but maybe for him it was the other way around. And that would be even more interesting to study his work under this premise and see, how he approached, and actually I didn't study, that much of Plečnik. I'm not knowing about his design strategies, but I think it would be worthwhile looking at.
Inspired by Jörg's words, I would like to continue this reflection, putting on the table a kind of a boring thing of architectural historians, and that is the consideration of his architectural culture. So he grows up in Ljubljana, then he goes to Vienna, studies under Otto Wagner, and one goes to his house, and of course we saw beautiful images of it, but there is one thing that is missing in our discourse today, and that's his books. What did he like? What did he study? Where did he go? In this sense, he was somehow lived in a total continuity with those architects from history that did a total betrayal of classicism. I'm talking about Otto Wagner, for instance. Then, for instance, Ledoux. I don't know exactly, but I'm absolutely sure that he knew very well Claude Nicolas Ledoux, the neoclassical architects that were not neoclassic, they were betraying classicism within the knowledge of, and then the great architects that we know that he admired, and that was Giulio Romano, Borromini, even if he was never, and he lived in the culture of Vienna when Baroque in some kind of way was discovered. The process of betraying, thank you, of reconsidering classicity under another point of view, which is bodily experience in space. No? Baroque, on contrary to Renaissance, which is a totally rational construct of Neoplatonic, blah, 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 the Baroque is the reaction toward this rationality, a kind of empathic, emotional, and he lived within this culture. In order also to understand this, you posed a lot of extremely crucial questions to understand this, the relationship of what is hidden, what is trying to be reappropriate, or what has to emerge from this form, is also this as the humanistic aspect of sprezzatura, was the betrayal of what is on what we have been formed on. I twisted too much words. We have been formed in, and we are reacting with the language from which we have been against the major race. So this is the kind of reaction.
I'm very happy. I am very happy that you mentioned the books. While preparing the show, I had the chance to spend a lot of time in the house, so I could really also study the books a lot. And what was very striking to me, and I understood also through this a bit, some points of fascination of the vocabulary of Plečnik. You know, when you psychoanalyze somebody, you are mostly interested in the tick. There's some tick. Everybody has a little tick. There are the things. There's the symptom. So, and Plečnik's symptom is the love for me to the ornament. A very strange tick. And the library is full of books. And studying the Middle East. Chinese, Asian Minor, vernacular architecture, carpets, everything what you can imagine. It is fascinating, and especially maybe it's also my perspective changed a bit after the last 5 years spending a lot in Armenia and Georgia and reading the architecture there with the influence from the east to the west. I think there's something what you maybe also with the Baroque and Vienna, you know, that the east is there in a different way present than in the rest of the west. And it's just an idea, it's just a feeling what I see there. And how he was really using the decorum in an extreme, interesting way. And that was really fascinating. And he has amazing books which already at that time were hard to get. And they were extremely rare. So there are some photo documentations of expeditions to Syria, Damascus, behind all these kind of things. Yeah, amazing. And it is, unfortunately, they should publish just an index of the books. That would be very helpful for people who would like to study it.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. So I like also to give you, please with the mic.
So everybody can hear.
Oh, okay, thank you. Olaf, how did it actually, how did you get this project? How did you get this project as a German artist to invade this sacred space? This is Plečnik's house. This is a question for you, and I have one more for Luka. Should I say it now, or why doesn't Plečnik have a place in the history of architecture as he should have, probably. Yeah. Thank you.
It's not only me, it's also an Italian who's accompanying me. So it's a German-Italian entrepreneurship. It is very simple. I liked, during Corona times, to travel. So I went to Ljubljana and I was alone there. And so but because as a professional you can ask the museums to visit them. And of course they're open to you. So then you're alone. And then we came just talking, and then they showed to me and they said, oh, I would love to do a show here. And you know, in Corona times people think differently. And so they said, why not? And I said, okay, why not? Let's do it. So, and that was the way how it started. And then it slowly turned into a more serious conversation. And there's also a kind of fascination of doing shows in houses where you are not allowed to change anything. And you're not allowed to touch anything, which is fantastic because you can do everything except these two things. So, and this is a lot. And then you come to the point where really things are happening, you know. You just have to think about it. So, you know, the fiction is there. You just have to tell a story. And so that is the fun of it. So we, also to invent things. That is the great fun part. And that feels quite familiar in this house. I mean, it's also there's more uncanny stuff, which were simple uncanny, the totally absence of females, you know, in the house. I mean, there is not a trace of a female in this house. I mean, maybe there is, but this is a difficult one. So, so there are all these kind of things. What you see there is an obsession of certain rationalizing space moments. It is crazy. It would be nice to ask an analyst to read just the house, but without telling this person who is reading it. What is he reading? You know, just give him images. Tell me something about the person. What do you think who is living here?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a very, very nice question that needs a lot of explanation, a lot of time. I will try to really be very short. I think Plečnik, you have to consider which history, because in Slovenia, Plečnik has a colossal role, so he is absolutely. If we look at on the level of the international historiography, recently he acquired a position. But traditionally, he was absent from the, let's say, the canonical books of history of architecture, also because history of architecture has been written in years that were practically, let's say, mainly concentrated on the centers of the global, at that time, let's say, Western production of architecture, which was always Berlin, Paris, London, New York, etc., and the peripheries were relatively ignored. No? Slovenia and Yugoslavia were peripheries. Then if we consider also socialist Yugoslavia, Plečnik was very much appreciated, but was absolutely not historicized. I mean, he was not particularly considered by, there were many architects that liked him, but if you look to the magazines, part of the Slovenians, I'm talking to you of the socialist Yugoslavia, he was not present. Also because many of the themes that are on the basis of the architectural historiographies at that time were not quite close to Plečnik's world, of Plečnik's language, especially language and Plečnik's sensibilities.
There is a question. I think there is also very interesting aspect concerning the reason why maybe this kind of history is not written yet. And we have seen now in the presentation maybe also some important aspects also of rewriting history. So on the one side, for example, the importance of Plečnik in the architecture, also in design, looking also at the history of design-driven perspective. For example, in the work, also Boštjan was showing to also analyzing the history of the spatial quality of this architecture and not just the historical context. That is, of course, very important, but also to reinterpret, in a sense, the architecture from an architectural perspective. I think it's also part maybe of the work now of rewriting a glossary through also language that is really informed by the architecture. And on the other side, also art is a form of research, dealing with the meaningful also layers of this architecture. And this kind of methodology is, of course, important of Plečnik, but maybe also has a relevance also in the way we are understanding the history of architecture at whole. But it's, of course, a very general, complex topic. There is a question there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all the presentations. It was quite fascinating to listen to. I'm not really sure, but I'm struggling with the term uncanny in relation to Plečnik's work in terms of this Freudian, subconscious, irrational notion. I personally encountered just some of the Prague projects, and I find him extremely calculated, extremely precise in his work, especially in his spatial scenographic precision. It's been said before, but I mean, for me it was especially mind-blowing because I only knew photographs, and it's really, really not the same to be there and to look at the, I mean, to be in the space. And if you look at the staircase at the Borg, for instance, I mean, it's geometrically pretty complex, but there's not a single joint in the masonry that ends nowhere. It's really incredible. And so, I mean, to me, the question is, maybe it makes more sense to describe the work as just another level of a complexity in a way, in terms of like mathematics going beyond natural numbers. And it's a question, but I mean, I don't find it irrational at all.
Reaction?
I think this was towards you, right?
Probably, yes, I assume, yes. But well, I mean, the irrational is not necessary, you know, the counter part of the rational. It's exactly very precise work, the work of Plečnik. But I think, you know, if we just call it complexity, there's something missing. I think with the uncanny, you know, we somehow point in a way where the complexity comes from. And this is for me important, you know. The complexity, you know, it's just a complexity and we don't know what for complexity. But I think with the uncanny, I think we give some hint, or there is some hint to where it comes from, right? And the uncanny is not the chaotic, not at all, you know. So the uncanny is this Unheimlich, the opposite from Heimlich. The Heimlich is the hidden, and this Unheimlich is the one which comes up and makes itself show and become visible. So, and it is rational, but it's a different kind of rational. So in psychoanalytical terms, certainly there's a rational, and there's a transformation, though, in the rational and the rationality of these things. So I would say, for me, complexity is a little bit too little. You know, we can apply to everything, you know, but we want to know the reason, where it comes from, and what the effect is of the complexity. And therefore, I think, and I would agree, we have to come up with terms, right? With basic terms or basic keywords that allow us somehow to get closer to the sources in terms of Plečnik's architecture.
Just to add an example, there is an obsession by one of many obsessions. There is one obsession, and then he puts always the column in the middle of the space, no, in the middle of the passage. You always find the library of in Ljubljana. You will find the column at the center. This is totally, I would say, the column is precise, is beautiful, is designed under, but is in the wrong place. I mean, in wrong place from the standpoint of the classical, but why he's always doing that? No, he always putting a column in the middle, no, of the cantata, we say, in the space. Sometimes there. I didn't hear. Sorry.
It's not arbitrary, therefore.
No, of course, but when you go and you search for the reasons, it has always another reason. There is not a reason, but the obsession, no, of transmuting, changing the classical position of things is at the core of his architecture, and in this sense, is playing. I don't know if we can say that it's an irrational thing. It's simply a definition that you proposed, uncanny, in the sense of we cannot explain everything with the reason, because the reason changes all the time, and these elements are maintaining this position in many, many different projects.
Yeah. No, like it's interesting how we heard different approaches, like how Jörg was pulling out the uncanny as something that becomes not fully visible but creates this mask in which it transfigures the classical order. And Jürgen, you were talking about a queering aspect in it, and I think there's really something which I can understand. It's not order versus non-order, but I think what's really cool is the idea of the twisting and kind of changing the repertoire, or even acting against kind of certain normalized standards, and creating and sometimes, and I think it's neither irrational nor let's just say in any way chaotic, or even it doesn't even seem, because Jörg, in your explanation, I sometimes thought, is it something that's really unconscious? And maybe that's what Silvan was irritated about. You know, is there something unconscious, psychological, wanting to push through? And maybe, but maybe it was much more calculated, that exactly, and this is maybe what Jürgen meant with queering, that that's not something subconscious from Plečnik that pushes through, but there's another order, or maybe another order wanting to push through what he tried when he twisted the classical order. So it's just an idea, like rubbing up a little bit of the conversation you had.
I think you can also maybe helpfully use the term the uncanny valley, what you maybe know from the digital. In the digital, the uncanny valley means if something is too perfect, then it's uncanny. You know, in the digital world, when they simulate the things too perfect, then it is totally uncanny. It doesn't work. So the uncanny is an effect. It is not an intention. And the irrational is not the pair where the uncanny fits in. The uncanny is a psychological effect. So, and this effect is depending on the position of the object and the perceiver, and they are changing all the time. So the rational and the irrational is just categories of description of actions. These are two totally different categories. You know, semiotic-wise, the uncanny is something what is not in the level of semiotics. It is an effect which you can describe when you want with semiotics, but you will not get anywhere. Look at the Sandmann of A.T.A. Hoffmann. What is the uncanny effect? A perfect robot.
Actually, I mentioned briefly also Nietzsche with the uncanny sublime. And this is also interesting because there actually two things come together, right? But Jörg, I think you're right. You know, the uncanny is already the result of a process of transformation, you know, where a different kind of rationality comes in, which you cannot tell what it is exactly. That would be in psychoanalytical terms. It comes out, and it might be then the sublime, or that which makes provokes fear or something like, because it's the unknown which works according to a certain rationale that is not known to the beholder or the person that receives it. So in this way, so this is how we look at Plečnik. We wonder ourselves, where does this come from? What is it? And still there's a system, and I think we would all agree about it. There's a system, and it repeats somehow through the various variations of form and material, and that it's a clear indicator, right? I would say it's a clear indicator for the uncanny.
Yeah. I don't know if this really adds to the conversation, but I think the idea of irritation, or let's say creating something that is not really graspable, that is common but at the same time, or feels common but at the same time starts to provoke you in a different way to rethink it, is also a political dimension. It makes you become a more active part of society. It makes you become more of aware, what are the spaces that you're moving in, how do you meet, even like what your example was with the churches, by configuring a different space and even pushing the columns. You want to force people to become more aware, to become an active part of a society, and I think that's what I see as a kind of a strategic goal. When you use issues of uncanny or the uncomfortable, let's say, awareness, that it makes you. It starts to. Oh, no, now I've lost my track. But it basically makes you become more of an active part of society, and it makes you rethinking what the structure of a society can be. So I think it's a clear, let's say, activator for change.
And I was just going to continue, Jürgen, what you said, and it's. Basically, it's a question of whether uncanny or unheimlich can become a design methodology. Or how you actually design, like as an architect, spaces, spatial sequences, open space, public space, which would be uncanny as a effect, but as the effect would be kind of to provoke your personal activity in that space. So it means, that by that way, the uncanny will actually generate the publicness, will actually generate public participation in the space, active engagement, And if you think, what as an architect you can do here, I don't know, just kind of as a give you an example, designing a strange shaped bench, which is something, you see and you are kind of provoked and irritated, you kind of like use your kilojoules of energy to kind of get used to, but then at the same time you can actually sit on it, or you can lean on, or you can hide on, it's something, it's an object or spatial sequence in the space which will require or afford for your sort of strong individual participation or engagement or involvement, And I think, this connection between publicness, porosity, and unheimlich could actually, this is also something, you learn from Plečnik,
I'm sorry, I have to, because the key thing was said by you, Olaf, again. There is not a single presence of a woman, maybe, in the house. So. It's unheimlich, and if we know a little bit of psychoanalysis and Freud, then we know that there is a lot, of these elements. And I don't know what Freud would talk about with Plečnik, and what do you think as an artist, and what do you think, Jürgen? What would he talk with him about?
We have very good psychoanalysts in Ljubljana. You should ask them.
I know, yeah, but I'm asking you.
The uncanny is nothing what you can calculate. You cannot produce uncanniness willingly. It's an effect which comes because it's unconscious. That's the thing. It's a result. If you want to create something what is uncanny, that will be nuts.
Because I think we have quite different understandings of what uncanny is here. And my question is, can we design uncanny? I don't think so. Is it something that can be a decision of an architect to do something uncanny in order to activate something?
I mean, yeah.
But we are also discussing the, if you want, the dimension they are activating, and they are really important, maybe also more important than the form itself. So I think it's also so interesting to discuss today also with you concerning a form that is also able to activate, and not just to design the form as such, maybe also dealing with really playful form, but trying to really reflect also together with the struggle also to reinterpret these architects, really trying to reveal the critical dimension, no? Maybe also the political dimension that this work could be also mean today, and the significance also of this work. Now you were also quoting Borromini. No, it's also another way to reinterpreting maybe the history of forms, not just as forms for the fields that are opening up. I think there is a reaction here, and I think from your side.
Maja just addressed, I think, a question also to me. I think Boštjan, he said, well, then maybe there's a design strategy of the uncanny. I'm not so sure, because I would rather agree with Olaf that it's the precondition, you know, the uncanny. There is always there's a process already prior to somehow to the design process that is at the basis of the thing. And maybe I would, if I can just add that Luka briefly mentioned Giulio Romano, and there it becomes rather clear. You know, Giulio Romano is a, can we call him a deconstructivist? There's the classicist order, and he makes his jokes, right? It's real jokes, you know, the cornerstones falling a little bit down and columns are a little bit tilted, and this kind of still that the house stands up, right? That would be somehow a kind of approach from the order to a disorder, something. And if you understand this, then we understand clearly that Plečnik is the opposite. Mm-hmm. It's not this. This is why he's not humorous, but this is why he is somehow, he's working from another basis, right? And working his way maybe up, but not reaching it maybe at a certain time, maybe also not wanting. I don't know yet.
Interesting point between the. I wanted to react on the thing if we can, you architects can design with in the universe of Uncanny. I don't think in absolute sense you can, but I think that every architecture that poses itself, that is based on the design of space and not on volume, gives to the perceiver the freedom to be interpreted. In this sense, not to be felt. I will feel a thing in a different way than anybody else because I know something and I will see in the space something specific to myself. And this is a level of, let's say, given of freedom given to the perceiver, which is part of this uncanny process. But this thing on Giulio Romano is it's very. We will talk about this later. It's true.
Yeah, I think we are at the end of our second section. So many thanks to you, to the presenters, also to discuss together, and also many thanks to, of course, the audience, to everyone who took part today in this event and also in the discussion. And many thanks to the students, and many thanks also to the participants, of course, of the first section. It was a pleasure to have you also in Berlin. So many thanks to also have found, in a sense, the way to Berlin. Plečnik brought us together today, and I think it was so interesting also from my side to see that we are discussing and trying to find an interpretation and trying to reactualize also this architecture for the future and also for the future interpretation of designing space. So many thanks, of course, also Birgit, for your fantastic organization to bringing these people together. And now we will continue also our event, and I give you the word.
Thank you. First of all, Lidia, so you already mentioned what I was just about to say, but I see there's the wine and some food waiting. So don't go away. We need a very short break now for sort of reorganizing, and then we will have a look at Adam Čech's photographs, which the Museum of Architecture from Ljubljana brought to Berlin. And we have Bogo Zupančič and Tomaž Štoka, who will introduce the photography. No? Yes, a little bit. And that's before we can jump to the wine. And one last sentence. I have to admit, I was a little bit nervous to bring Plečnik to Berlin and to sort of to bring forward this format with all these different people. And I'm really happy that we have had this discussion, and I think it was a good, both sessions were a very good discussion we had today. So the opening of the exhibition is sort of upstairs. If you go out, you just take the big stairs, and then on the gallery space, that's where we go now. Anything else open? Question? No. So, and